As I'm making this video, World of Warcraft has had 9 expansions to the base vanilla game. In this video, we'll be looking at the pre-order bonuses for each expansion and how they compare to one another, with the most recent expansion being Dragonflight. Before we begin, we need to discuss the different types of editions. WoW's early history usually saw more physical releases, and since the rapid growth of the internet, more recent expansions have usually seen more digital sales than physical sales. We can therefore broadly categorize most WoW editions into 2 groups, with one group being physical editions, which includes collector editions, and the other group being completely digital editions. Every pre-order also comes in different available tiers. While these formats have changed a bit in the past decade or so, 2 of these tiers have remained constant throughout WoW's entire life so far. The Standard Edition, which is also called the Base Edition in more recent expansions, is the lowest tier. This tier is by far the most commonly purchased edition of WoW since it's the cheapest. The other edition of the game that has been constant throughout WoW's life is the Collector's Edition. This is the most expensive of the pre-order tiers and always includes exclusive physical goods and rewards. Beginning in Mists of Pandaria, WoW began releasing digital deluxe editions. These editions have released alongside every WoW expansion from Mists of Pandaria to Battle for Azeroth. Beginning with Shadowlands pre-orders, the digital deluxe edition was further split into 2 categories, the Heroic Edition and the Epic Edition. Dragonflight pre-orders also featured both the Heroic and Epic editions. Before we get into the details of all the expansions editions and their pre-orders, it's important to note we will only be discussing prices in USD. Other currencies are important, of course, but this video would be quite long and boring if we just started spewing out random numbers and currencies for each and every edition of each and every expansion. Let's begin by talking about Vanilla. While Vanilla is not an expansion and it had much more content than most WoW expansions, it's an important baseline to start with for comparisons for later expansions. The Vanilla Standard WoW Edition costs $49.99, and the Collector's Edition costs $79.99. Both the Collector's Edition and the retail box for the Standard Vanilla game were released on November 23, 2004, the same day the game went live. This means there were no pre-orders for the game when it came out in 2004, but pre-orders also weren't really a thing yet. The original World of Warcraft Standard Edition came with the game on 5 DVD discs, a World of Warcraft game manual, a guest pass to create a starter account, and of course the all-important Blizzard product catalog. The World of Warcraft Collector's Edition contained a special box with the full game on both CD-ROM and a DVD-ROM, a 1-month subscription to World of Warcraft, and a voucher with a special key that could be redeemed by a friend for 10 days of free playtime. Also included was the World of Warcraft soundtrack CD, a special Collector's Edition game manual which was signed by the World of Warcraft development team, and a Blizzard store pamphlet. Now we get to the cool items in the Collector's Edition. The first item was a hardcover book entitled The Art of World of Warcraft, which has 208 pages. There are various subjects of the book divided into roughly 6 sections. The first section contains artwork for all 8 of the original races, the second section focuses on monsters, the third environments, and the fourth showcases structures and weapons. The fifth section of the art book is devoted to cinematics, with the complete process laid out from storyboard to the finished art. The final section was a promotional section, which had full-page artwork, special drawings from South Korea, and the Blizzard 2003 Christmas card. There was also a snazzy map of the game world made out of cloth that was included in the Collector's Edition box. The penultimate item was a behind-the-scenes DVD, which featured mini cinematics and cutscenes, 3D concept models and art, sketches and drawings, and screenshots of the game during its development. Finally, the Collector's Edition DVD also included audio tracks and interviews of Blizzard employees talking extensively about the many aspects of the game. Last but not least, the Collector's Edition also included an exclusive in-game pet. There were 3 very hard to choose from pets. These pets included a Zergling from the StarCraft franchise, a Panda Cub, and a Mini Diablo from the Diablo franchise. Owning any of these 3 pets currently will give the player a feat of strength achievement. Blizzard made a limited number of copies of the Collector's Edition and has said they will not make any more. Due to it being the oldest Collector's Edition, having the fewest numbers produced, and how lesser well-known the game was still in 2004, the original World of Warcraft Collector's Edition is by far the rarest Collector's Edition in WoW. The Burning Crusade Standard WoW Edition cost $39.99 USD, and the Collector's Edition cost $69.99. It took roughly 15 months from the announcement of TBC before the expansion went live. TBC was announced in October 2005, and it was a year later in November 2006 that the prices were revealed. The expansion finally went live on January 17, 2007, meaning the pre-order window only lasted roughly 2 months. The TBC Standard Edition contained the expansion on 4 DVDs for Windows 2000 and Windows XP. It also included the game on 2 DVDs for Windows Vista and Windows 7. Although players only needed some of the DVDs to download and play the game, in total the game came across 6 discs. Since Vanilla only came on 5, TBC marks the most discs the game has come on in an expansion. The TBC Standard Edition also came with a game manual, a Blizzard product catalog, and 1 to 3 World of Warcraft guest passes. The TBC Collector's Edition came with the game on both CD and DVD. There were 4 CD-ROMs in a jeweled case and 1 DVD-ROM in a cardboard sleeve. The Collector's Edition also contained another DVD, which was a behind the scenes. This DVD featured more than 2 hours of developer interviews and commentary on all the aspects of the creation of the Burning Crusade, as well as trailers and cinematics from the game, and even footage of panel discussions from BlizzCon. The Collector's Edition also contained a Burning Crusade hardcover art book. Similar to the vanilla art book, it's a hardcover coffee table book with exclusive concept art. Also included in the Collector's Edition was the Burning Crusade soundtrack on DVD, a Burning Crusade themed Blizzard product catalog, and 2 World of Warcraft 10-day guest pass keys. Blizzard had also launched the World of Warcraft trading card game by this point, and every Collector's Edition of the Burning Crusade came with 2 World of Warcraft trading card game starter set packs, as well as several exclusive cards. This meant there was a chance for a card to contain one of the digital mounts or pets if you gave the correct code on the card to Blizzard. To date, some of the WoW TCG pets and mounts are among the most rare and sought after in the entire game. Alongside the cards, there was also the card game rulebook and 3 promotional cards. The final 2 items were a fancy mousepad with a map of Outland on it, and an exclusive in-game pet which was called the Netherwhelp. Owning the Netherwhelp pet in the current game will grant the player a Feat of Strength achievement. However, surprisingly, there were 3 controversies surrounding the Netherwhelp pet. First, players found in 2020 they were no longer able to claim the Netherwhelp despite having a valid, unused code that was 14 years old. Second, due to a technical mistake, European players could not receive the Netherwhelp pet. To compensate, Blizzard offered European players the Lurky Warlock pet with the addition of 2 free game days on their subscription. Finally, due to another technical error, players who had first bought the Standard Edition were unable to upgrade their edition to the Collector's Edition and could not receive the Netherwhelp pet. The Wrath of the Lich King expansion followed the exact same model as the Burning Crusade, with the Standard Edition costing $39.99 and the Collector's Edition costing $69.99. Wraths followed TBC's launch schedule of 15 months as well. Wrath was announced in August of 2007 and went live in November of 2008, with pre-orders starting in September, making the pre-order window 2 months long, the same as the Burning Crusade. The Standard Edition of World of Warcraft Wrath of the Lich King came with 3 DVDs. One DVD had Wrath on it, but it also required the player to have already installed the Burning Crusade expansion. The other 2 DVDs were only the Wrath expansion and did not require TBC to be installed already. The Standard Edition also came with a Wrath of the Lich King game manual and a Blizzard product catalog, in addition to a 10-day free guest pass key. The Collector's Edition for Wrath was also nearly identical to the one from the Burning Crusade. It came with the game on DVD and 2 other DVDs. The second DVD was a behind-the-scenes movie containing over an hour of developer interviews, the Wrath of the Lich King intro cinematic with director's commentary, and more. The final CD was the soundtrack, which contained 21 tracks, among which were several bonus tracks. Also included was the book The Art of World of Warcraft Wrath of the Lich King, which had 208 pictures of stunning artwork. A mousepad with a map of Northrend was also included in the Collector's Edition, and the penultimate item was 2 World of Warcraft trading card game March of the Legion starter decks, along with 2 exclusive cards only available in the Collector's Edition. Finally, last but not least, the Collector's Edition also included an exclusive in-game pet named Frosty. Frosty is the cutest little baby frostworm you'll ever see and has a description text which reads, "Accidentally created when the Lich King's deathly powers raised Rhymefang from undeath." Players who own Frosty have a Feat of Strength achievement in-game. The Cataclysm Standard WoW Edition once again cost $39.99, the same as the WoW's 2 previous expansions. However, the Cataclysm Collector's Edition costs $79.99, a $10 increase from Wrath's Collector's Edition. Cataclysm was announced in August of 2009 and went live in December of 2010, with pre-orders starting Battle.net on November 2nd, 2010. This was 16 months and remains the longest time between any expansion in WoW's history. However, 60 months is also only 1 more month than the 15 months between Vanilla and TBC and Wrath. Since it is roughly the same to the production schedule TBC and Wrath, it makes it all the more impressive what the team was really able to pull off in only 16 months. Pre-orders for Cataclysm started in July of 2010, 5 months before the game went live. Making 5 new zones and revamping almost all of the Eastern Kingdoms of Caliber in 16 months is an amazing feat, and one that is often overlooked. The WoW team learned many lessons from Cataclysm development, and they would use these lessons to streamline the process for later expansions. The 16-month crunch also meant that a lot of content had to be cut, and you can check out our video on all the cut content from Cataclysm in the link in the description below. The Standard Edition to Cataclysm included a game on 1 DVD, a Cataclysm game manual, a Blizzard product catalog, 1 WoW guest pass, and 1 StarCraft 2 guest pass. The Collector's Edition to Cataclysm was nearly identical to that of Wrath's and TBC's. The Collector's Edition came in a special box which contained the expansion on both CD-ROM and DVD-ROM, as well as the Cataclysm game manual. 2 other DVDs were also included, a 17-track soundtrack CD, which included 7 exclusive bonus tracks, and behind-the-scenes DVD containing over an hour developer interviews, the Cataclysm intro cinematic with director's commentary, and more. Also included was the Art of Cataclysm, which had 176 pages of art featuring never-before-seen images from the archives of the Blizzard's film department and the World of Warcraft development team. Once again, a mousepad also came with the Collector's Edition. This mousepad featured Deathwing and a map of the newly ravaged Azeroth. Additionally, the Collector's Edition also contained a World of Warcraft trading card game class starter deck, along with 2 exclusive hero cards that were only available to the Collector's Edition. The Cataclysm pre-orders saw some of the first cross-promotion between Blizzard games. This standard edition included a StarCraft 2 pass, and if the player already owned StarCraft 2, they could redeem a code from the Collector's Edition to receive 2 exclusive portraits for the StarCraft profile account. These 2 portraits were Goblin and Worgen Marines, reflecting the 2 new races that were added in Cataclysm. Finally, the World of Warcraft Collector's Edition contained an exclusive in-game pet. This pet's name was Little Deathwing, and he was received via an in-game mail. This special accompanying letter from the WoW dev team said, "Thank you for your purchase of the Cataclysm expansion. As a special gift of appreciation, we would like to present you with this ferocious little companion. He may loathe Azeroth with a seething rage that knows no bounds, but he sure loves you." Players who own Little Deathwing have a special feat of strength achievement. StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty became free to play in 2017. This meant that players who had received the portraits for StarCraft with their Cataclysm pre-order, but did not own StarCraft 2, could now claim their portraits without having to pay for the game. The Mists of Pandaria pre-order had the same pricing as Cataclysm expansion, with the standard edition of MOP being $39.99, and the Collector's Edition being $79.99. MOP also saw the addition of a third tier pre-order, called the Digital Deluxe Edition. This edition cost $59.99, placing it right in the middle of the standard edition of MOP and the Collector's Edition. $20 between tiers was initially only between the standard and Collector's Edition, but MOP added a third $20 tier step. For comparison, the TBC editions were $39.99 for standard and $59.99 for collectors. The MOP editions were $39.99 for standard, $59.99 for Digital Deluxe, and $79.99 for the Collector's Edition. Mists of Pandaria was announced in October 2011 and went live in September 2012. This was roughly an 11th-month period and began the precedent of announcing an expansion and then releasing the expansion within 1 year. Pre-orders for MOP started in July of 2012, 2 months before the expansion launched. The MOP Standard Edition contained the game on 2 DVDs, a MOP Quick Start Guide, 2 guest passes, and a fancy Mists of Pandaria notepad. The Digital Deluxe Edition made its debut with the following items: a digital copy of the game, an exclusive in-game Lucky Quillian pet, and an exclusive in-game Empyrean Quillen mount. Both these items give the player a feat of strength achievement. The MOP Digital Deluxe Edition first implemented the pet and mount component of a new expansion pre-order, which still continues to this day. 2 other promotional tie-ins were also added for the Digital Deluxe Edition. The first were 2 exclusive StarCraft 2 portraits, one of an infested orc and the other of a Night Elf Templar. The second promotional tie-in was an exclusive Mists of Pandaria banner sigil and an accent for Diablo 3. The Collector's Edition included all of the previously mentioned items. Since MOP introduced the Digital Deluxe Edition, most digital goodies fell within the new category. The Collector's Edition then became mostly physical items. For example, the Collector's Edition of MOP contained an art book, unsurprisingly titled The Art of Mists of Pandaria. This hardcover book contained 208 pages and shows everything from early concept drawings to the final 3D renderings. And also included was a behind-the-scenes DVD and Collector's Edition soundtrack CD. Finally, a mousepad featuring Chen Stormstout was also included. Many players felt the introductions of a third tier was redundant and unnecessary. But by 2012, the users of DVDs and CDs was heavily on the decline. This meant Blizzard would sell far fewer physical standard copies. So they were smart and rolled new digital goodies into the Digital Deluxe bundle. The second controversy around the MOP pre-order editions came in 2020. The Mists of Pandaria editions were no longer available for purchase and were archived on March 3rd, 2014. However, on June 30th, 2020, the mount and pet were made available for purchase again separately on the BNet store. While never explicitly stated, it was heavily presumed the Collector's Edition items are temporary and rare, and this drew some warranted outrage in the WoW community. Now we move on to one of everyone's favorite expansions, Warlords of Draenor. WoW saw a $10 price increase across the board, with the Standard Edition becoming $49.99, the Digital Deluxe Edition becoming $69.99, and the Collector's Edition becoming $89.99. WoW was announced in November 2013 and went live in November of 2014, essentially 1 exact year later. WoW started the trend of expansions being announced and then released almost exactly 1 year later, and this trend has so far continued or been even shorter since. Pre-orders for WoW started in September 2014, 2 months before the launch of the expansion. The standard edition for World of Warcraft Warlords of Draenor came out on 4 DVDs, along with the WoD Quick Start Guide, several guest passes, and a Blizzard Entertainment notepad. Also included was a coupon on the Blizzard Gear Store for 20% off, but only on select items. The last item was a level 90 character boost. This was the first time characters were introduced to the game, and from here on out, character boosts will become a staple of many pre-order editions. The Digital Deluxe Edition of WoD contained a digital copy as well as a level 90 character boost. It also included the Dread Hatchling pet and the Dread Raven mount. Once again, players who own these items received 2 special feat of strength achievements. The WoD Digital Deluxe Edition also included 3 cross promotions. The WoD Digital Deluxe Edition came with 2 exclusive StarCraft 2 portraits of Grommash Hellscream and Blackhand. It also had a Warsong pendant for Diablo 3. Finally, it contained an Ironhorn themed card back for Hearthstone. By this point, the collector's edition of each expansion had become roughly the same in regards to the fact that there were 4 core components. The WoD Collector's Edition contained pretty much the same items that had been in the collector's editions for the last 3 expansions. the game on DVD, a behind the scenes DVD, the WoD soundtrack, a book from the art team named The Art of Warlords of Draenor, and finally a mousepad with a picture of Blackhand on it. This isn't to demean the WoD's Collector's Edition when I say it was the same as the other expansion's Collector's Editions, but rather that Blizzard had developed a nice cookie-cutter Collector's Edition formula by Warlords of Draenor. We're bringing attention to it here to show just how much of a dramatic change the Collector's Edition will go through in the rest of the video. Now, the Warlords of Draenor pre-order was the first to feature cross-promotions for 3 games that weren't WoW. While this is nice and all, many quickly pointed out that they were in fact mostly useless since the vast majority of people who buy WoW intend to play WoW and not some other Blizzard game. This led many online to say that all the effort that went into these cross-promotions are essentially useless for them and wondered why they should be included in the pre-order pricing. While the character boost controversy could be an entire video on its own, let's just tell a fun little story. When the boosts were first introduced on February 18th, 2014, new 90 spawned at their faction's landing on the Timeless Isle. The Timeless Isle is a hotspot for PvP activity because of the Censer of Eternal Agony and all the goodies that bloody coins can provide. Well, a slight oversight by Blizzard saw these new level 90s were automatically flagged for PvP, and you can see where this is going. These level 90 character spawning points quickly became a huge disaster, with players constantly camping the spawn locations for easy kills. Quite literally a spawn kill. Blizzard eventually fixed this problem by moving the spawn point to the faction shrines in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, and later moved the spawn point to Stormwind and Orgrimmar for the Alliance and Horde respectively. Finally, before we move on to the Legion pre-orders, I want to quickly say that because so much of WoD was scrapped to make Legion, we do have an entire video on everything that was cut from Warlords of Draenor as well, which you can also check out in the video description. Legion saw the same pricing as Warlords of Draenor, with the standard edition costing $49.99, the digital deluxe being $69.99, and the collector's edition being $89.99. Legion was announced in August of 2015 and launched 1 year later in August of 2016. Legion saw the beginning of a much longer pre-order period, with pre-orders for Legion beginning November 2015. That's a 10-month pre-order period, twice the length of the Cataclysm pre-order period. Presumably, the pre-orders was launched so early to help ease the money woes at the end of WoD, but we can only speculate. The standard edition of Legion came with the game and a level 100 character boost. Alternatively, you can also buy a digital standard edition of Legion, which did not include a physical copy of the game. This standard edition also came with the Legion Quick Start Guide, some World of Warcraft guest passes, a 20% discount for Blizzard Gear Store and select Legion-themed items, and finally a Blizzard Entertainment notepad. The digital deluxe pre-order version of Legion came with a level 100 character boost as well as a mount and pet. The mount is the Illidari Fellstalker and the pet is named Nibbles, and obtaining them gives the player 2 feats of strength. The item store page description said, "Talk the invading demonic forces atop one of the burning legion's own twisted hounds of war, and summon a delightfully demented companion to keep you warm by the Fellfire," both available immediately upon pre-purchase. As a little fun fact, summoning the Illidari Fellstalker whilst being accompanied by Nibbles causes a heart to appear over Nibbles' head. In fact, a similar event happens with all pre-order pets and mounts. The cross-promotions of the Digital Deluxe and Collector's Edition also contain 3 cross-promotions, just like the WoD pre-orders had, and essentially all the same thing. The pre-orders contain 2 exclusive StarCraft 2 portraits of Illidan Stormrage and Gul'dan, the Wings of Betrayer and the Demon Hunter Helm Transmog for Diablo 2, and Heroes of the Storm Fellstalker mount. The Collector's Edition of Legion included a game on DVD, the Art of Legion book, a behind-the-scenes DVD, the soundtrack, and a Legion mousepad featuring Gul'dan and Illidan. Interestingly, the Collector's Edition also included a unique Hearthstone card bag. The fact the Hearthstone card art was not included with the Digital Deluxe Edition was a bit strange, and many wondered why it was called the Digital Deluxe Edition if it didn't even have all the digital goodies. Next, similar to the MOP pre-order mountain pet, the Legion pre-order mountain pet became available for purchase from the Blizzard Battle.net store and in-game shop for $10 starting on July 11th, 2021. However, this same day the Legion bundle was also taken down. After Legion came Battle for Azeroth expansion. BFA kept the same pricing as WoD in Legion pre-orders, but it also increased the price of the Collector's Edition by $10. The pricing for BFA stood at $49.99 for the Standard Edition, $6.99 for the Digital Deluxe Edition, and $99.99 for the Collector's Edition. BFA was announced in November 2017 and went live in August of 2018, which was the shortest announcement till launch period in the history of WoW at 10 months at the time. Pre-orders for BFA began on January 30th, 2018, and the Collector's Edition was announced on April 5th, 2018. That makes a 7-month pre-order window for the Standard and Digital Deluxe Editions and a 4-month period for the Collector's Edition. BFA was revolutionary in the fact that none of the editions contained a physical DVD copy of the game. Blizzard had gone digital, and instead of shipping DVDs, they shipped game keys. The Standard Edition of BFA contained only a game key and the BFA themed notepad. The Digital Deluxe Edition of BFA came with a game key and a level 110 character boost. There were actually 2 mounts in this pre-order, the Seabraid Stallion for the Alliance and the Gilded Ravissar for the Horde. The pet featured in the Digital Deluxe Edition is named Toddle. Like all pre-orders, owning the pet and mount with the same pre-order will give the player 2 feats of strength. Since there are 2 mounts and 1 pet with the BFA pre-order, the players actually earn 3 feats of strength. The cross-promotions of the BFA pre-order Digital Deluxe and Collector's Editions are numerous. Buying the pre-order for BFA at the digital or collector tier unlocked an Azeroth as burning card back in Hearthstone. In Heroes of the Storm, players were rewarded with the Primal Flamesaber mount. This mount unlocked a feat of strength achievement called Herald of Flames. In Overwatch, the BFA pre-order unlocked 4 new emotes on 2 characters. Tracer gained the Alliance Banner and Horde Banner emotes, while Torbjorn gained for the Alliance and for the Horde emotes. Additionally, for Overwatch, avatar icons of Zandalar and Kulturos were added, as well as sprays for Anduin, Jaina, Sylvanas, and Varrock Saurfang. Finally, with the purchase of the BFA pre-order, Alliance and Horde sprays were unlocked in StarCraft 2. The Collector's Edition came with all of the content of the Digital Deluxe Edition with the addition of 2 physical goods, both of which were faction-themed. The first of these was a hardback, double-sided storybook containing the stories Elegy by Christy Golden and A Good War by Robert Brooks. Elegy tells the story from the Alliance side, and Good War tells the story from the Horde perspective. Each story includes original artwork exclusive to their editions. Because this book was a product itself, BFA is the only expansion to not feature an art book so far. The second item was a large coin with the Alliance symbol on one side and a Horde symbol on the other. This mark of allegiance also came with a nifty stand. The final item included in the Collector's Edition was the soundtrack of BFA. For the first time since the established $20 a tier model adopted in MoP, the BFA's Collector's Edition was $30 more than the Digital Deluxe Edition, not the usual increase of $20 to the next tier. Another complaint was the BFA pre-orders were all digital. Yes, very few people needed a DVD to install BFA, but for many WoW collectors, the sole expansion without a DVD in its collection is a major disappointment. People like their collections to be the same each time and to not change. The physical standard edition only came with a game key and a notebook, which many people felt underwhelmed by. Spending $50 feels a lot better when you're holding a disc instead of a piece of paper and a notepad. Finally, there was some criticism on the digital soundtrack being an extra in the Collector's Edition. With the rise of music streaming services such as Spotify, many people only had to wait a couple of months until Blizzard released the soundtrack commercially. Then almost anyone could hear the soundtrack without having to pay for it. Now we move on from the troubled expansion BFA to another troubled expansion that was Shadowlands. The Shadowlands Standard WoW Edition cost $39.99, which was a $10 decrease from BFA Standard Edition. However, Shadowlands also saw the removal of the Digital Deluxe tier, which was replaced by 2 tiers, the Heroic and Epic editions. The Heroic edition of Shadowlands cost $59.99, a $10 decrease from BFA's Digital Deluxe version. The Epic edition of Shadowlands cost $79.99, which was a $10 increase from BFA's Digital Deluxe version. Finally, the Collector's Edition of Shadowlands cost $119.99, a $20 increase from BFA's Collector's Edition. Shadowlands was announced in November 2019 and went live in November of 2020, 1 year later. As a quick aside, it could be argued that the Digital Deluxe Edition became the Heroic Edition, and so only the Epic Edition was added in Shadowlands. Semantics aside, we've chosen to separate the Digital Deluxe Editions and Heroic Editions for the sake of simplicity. The Standard Edition, now called the Base Edition of Shadowlands, contained only a digital copy of the game and early access to Death Knights for allied races and Pandaren. The Heroic Edition of Shadowlands added a level 50 character boost, which was a 120 boost prior to 9.0, although this was done because of the new level squish. Additionally, the Heroic Edition included the Ensorcelled Everworm mount, as well as the vestments of the Eternal Traveler Transmog set, which was a quest associated with the mount. Owning the mount granted the player the feat of strength achievement Heroic Edition Ensorcelled Everworm. The Epic Edition of Shadowlands added a 30-day game time, the Anima Wormling pet, the Eternal Traveler's Hearthstone, and the illusion Wrath Chill, which is a unique cosmetic effect for weapons. For some reason, the Anima Wormling pet does not have a feat of strength achievement associated with it, making it the first pet to not have one on a pre-order edition. This will probably eventually be fixed, but it's kind of a weird oversight. Like BFA's Collector's Edition, Shadowlands Collector's Edition featured several physical rewards in addition to the soundtrack for the expansion. Among these items were 4 pins of the Covenant sigils and the art book, The Art of World of Warcraft Shadowlands. The art book is worth going into a little bit more detail as it only features art of the 5 main zones of the Shadowlands and Oribos. Finally, the mousepad returned in this Collector's Edition after being absent in the BFA's Collector's Edition. The mousepad that shipped with the Collector's Edition to Shadowlands was the Shattered Sky, where Sylvanas broke the Hell of Domination. Shadowlands saw the introduction of a 4th tier, which to some seemed rather odd that the game was beginning to have so many spread out tiers just to buy a singular item. That is, the expansion itself. This was the first Collector's Edition to not feature a behind the scenes DVD, and many were particularly disappointed by that. Yes, many people don't use DVDs anymore, but Blizzard could just upload the videos to your YouTube channel if they really wanted to, instead of just completely scrapping it. The Collector's Edition was announced on July 8th, 2020, 8 months after the 3 tiers were made public. The Collector's Edition would provide the ability to have the initial digital edition purchase reimbursed in Blizzard balance to the customer's account up to March 31st, 2021. As an interesting note, Collector's Editions are almost always shipped around the time the expansion goes live. The Collector's Edition of Shadowlands was shipped on October 13th, which coincides with Shadowlands being over a month behind schedule when it launched. Now we'll move on to Classic The Burning Crusade. The There was no pre-order for Classic Burning Crusade, and you could clone your classic character to be put on the TBC server for free at the beginning of TBC, which was far cheaper than having to rebuy the expansion at least $40. However, the monetization of Classic TBC was heavily pushed, and caused a lot of controversy and backlash. Classic TBC had no pre-order, but it does follow very similar patterns of expansion pre-order pricing. The standard Classic Burning Crusade Digital Upgrade Edition, called the Dark Portal Pass, cost $39.99, the same price as the original expansion from 2006. Players could also spend $20 more for a Deluxe Edition, which was $69.99. Although it was only called the Deluxe Edition, not the Digital Deluxe Edition, the pricing is the same as the Digital Deluxe Edition of Warlords of Draenor, Legion, and BFA. Classic TBC was announced on February 2021 and went live on June 2021, 5 months later, although technically the pre-patch was on May 18th. Although the Dark Portal Pass was limited to one character, it sure provided a lot. It included a level 58 character boost, automatically learning the apprentice riding skill, and all the appropriate gear for the character. Additionally, there was a blue quality mount based on the character's race, starting gold, and 4 12-slot bags, with Warlocks also receiving 3 bags and a soul bag. Finally, it raised the character's weapon skill to 290, unlocked all Azeroth flight paths, and set the reputation for the character's race faction to friendly. The Deluxe Edition of Classic TBC included all of the contents of the Dark Portal Pass plus 30 days of World of Warcraft game time. For Classic TBC, it included the reawakened Phase Hunter mount, the Path of Illidan toy, which causes your character's footsteps to leave flickering felfire in their wake for a short time, and a Dark Portal Hearthstone. Finally, the Deluxe Edition also awarded the Viridian Phase Hunter mount to the players of the Shadowlands version of World of Warcraft. All of the controversy surrounding Classic TBC for this could be made into a video of itself, but some of the biggest on this list would be the /spit emote being removed because players were using it on people who bought the store items, how this pricing system fueled rampant botting problems, and finally how it was not free to transfer a classic character to a TBC server, which cost $25. Finally, we get into the most recent pre-orders for an expansion as of making this video, Dragonflight, where their pricing tiers are the same as Shadowlands, but with a $10 increase across all 4 tiers. The standard Dragonflight edition costs $49.99, the Heroic edition costs $69.99, and the Epic edition costs $89.99, and the Collector's edition costs $129.99. Dragonflight was announced in April of 2022, and was released in November of 2022, giving an 8-month pre-order window. The base edition World of Warcraft Dragonflight includes a digital copy of the game and a pet named Drax. The Heroic Edition adds a level 60 character boost, the Tangled Dreamweaver mount, and the Mercastraza Murloc pet. The Epic Edition adds the Time Walker's Hearthstone toy, the Diadem of the Spellkeeper head transmog, and the Wings of Awakening back transmog ensemble, a 5-color variant representing each primary Dragonflight. The Collector's Edition of Physical Goods includes the Art of the Dragonflight art book, an Alexstrasza mousepad, a Dragonflight 5-pin collector set, with 1 pin for each of the 5 main Dragonflights. It was announced that Drax, the pet given with the pre-order, would be removed at the launch of Dragonflight. Since collector's editions usually ship around the same time, that meant many people with the collector's editions would not be able to redeem their pet Drax when the package finally arrived. Blizzard's brilliant solution to this problem was to have those players buy another edition of Dragonflight below the collector's edition. This would ensure the player would get the Drax pet before the expansion launched. Once the collector's edition arrived, the players could redeem their extra money spent by entering the collector's edition Dragonflight code and converting it into Blizzard store balance. Another complaint was that the Wings of Awakening transmog items were static and did not move. Blizzard obviously has the technology to make them move, and we've even seen Wings move on other gear in the game. Classic Wrath of the Lich King was announced alongside the Dragonflight expansion, and for the first time, Blizzard decided to drop the additions in the names for classic products, instead just referring to them as upgrades. Additionally, there was no base option included anymore. The Heroic upgrade was priced at $59.99. It included 1 level 70 character boost, along with a boosted character automatically learning the expert riding skill alongside obtaining a mount, some starting gear, and some gold for the boosted character. This edition also included both a toy and a pet exclusive only to Wrath Classic. The pet was named Pebble, and the toy is called Fish Speaker's Lucky Lure. The Northrend Epic upgrade cost $79.99 and included all of the items in the Heroic upgrade, plus the Tuskar Shore Glider mount, which is not available in Classic WoW. Instead, Classic players received the Kalawak Whalebone Glider mount. Additionally, this upgrade also added 30 days of game time. Now that we've rambled on for nearly 30 minutes, let's appreciate the old adage of a picture is worth 1,000 words and look at some graphical comparisons. First, we have the pre-order pricing. Vanilla, Classic TBC, and Classic Wrath of the Lich King were not pre-orders and were only here for comparisons. Next, we have announcement to launch of expansion versus pre-order times. BFA Collector's Edition was announced 3 months later than the other BFA editions. And finally, a graph of everything that was in all of the various collector's editions. Marketing and the future. This 4-tiered system of pre-orders is probably here to stay, for good or for ill. It should be noted the 4-tier system is not uncommon in WoW. For example, raid difficulties fall into 4 groups, as do dungeons. The loot progression at max level is also usually 4 levels: green, blue, purple, and orange. Inflation and other real-world reasons aside, at least the marketing team is trying to be thematic, so props to them. Now, to wrap up this long video, we did not include the 15th anniversary edition or new player editions of WoW, since those were not pre-orders and they were not heavily advertised. Of course, this video has only barely scratched the surface of all of the logistics and time constraints of making expansions, marketing them, and selling them, but that is for another video for another time. Microtransactions are something that become almost a guaranteed part of games these days. However, back in the days of 2004 when WoW first launched, they weren't even thought of. Or were they? And of course, for the purposes of this video, a microtransaction is an in-game item that is either made easier to obtain or is only obtainable through a real money purchase. First, let's start in 2004. The very second WoW Vanilla launched, and we already have microtransactions. Starting with the Collector's Edition, a more expensive version of the base game that came with many real-life items like a mousepad, an art book, some music discs, etc, etc. However, it also came with an in-game good, one of 3 pets of your choice to all of your characters. A little Diablo from Diablo, a little Zergling from StarCraft, or a baby panda from Warcraft's Pandaria? These 3 pets were, and still are, only attainable by buying the WoW Vanilla's Collector's Edition. This has caused some issues recently, as WoW Classic and Retail are, as Blizzard have said, 100% separate entities. However, if you have the Retail Collector's Edition, you also get these pets in Classic WoW. Meaning over 15 years later, with the re-release of Vanilla WoW and WoW Classic, the only way to get these pets on the new Classic WoW is to pay a few $1,000s to buy an unopened Vanilla Collector's Edition. And really, Collector's Editions would come for every expansion afterwards, and with little to no changes other than what general rewards were given. Then we move on to 2005, the first real year of WoW. And well, what do we have? A new style of microtransactions, the BlizzCon items. This being the Murky Egg, which summoned the famous Murky Companion, obtained from going to BlizzCon, which was quite expensive really. Tickets were a fair price, and most players you needed to buy plane tickets, a hotel room, and a much more simply just to go to BlizzCon to get the code required. That or buy one offline and hope that you didn't get scammed. Then with 2006 and the soon coming arrival of TBC, we got a few new things. First, we got the first character service, Realm Transfer. For a price, this allowed characters to transfer their characters from one server to another. However, having a 6-month cooldown per character only lowered many years later, meaning you could not transfer willy-nilly. Some would say this was the first nail in the coffin for server identity. Got a reputation for being a scumbag ninja looter? Then just Realm Transfer. The next new microtransaction was a cross-promotion. WoW was becoming huge, and with this they decided to make a trading card game. And to help sell this, they added special loot cards to the TCG. These cards had a rare chance of being found in specific card expansions, and could be redeemed in-game in WoW. Many of these could even be sold at the auction house, meaning in a way, you could now exchange real-life money for in-game gold without the risk of getting banned for buying stuff off of a shifty website. The first expansion was the Heroes of Azeroth, and had the Tabard of the Flame, the Hippogriff Hatchling Pet, and the Riding Turtle mount. Before we move on, a couple cool facts about the Riding Turtle. When it was first added, it had no use. It was the same speed as the default run speed, and in some cases was even slower, and it was not until much later on when it got a swim speed added to it. Another cool fact is that in Warlords of Draenor, this was the only TCG mount made available in-game, now able to be fished up in the garrison's fishing pond, made hilariously easy with the fishing parties of the Legion pre-patch cross-realm grouping. Now, on to the year of 2007, and with the launch of TBC, we had a Collector's Edition again, giving a pet. However, instead of a choice of 3 pets, you got one specific one, a Nether Drake Whelp pet. However, EU players, as a bug, got the Lurky pet, a white baby murloc as well.
We do nothing, we go grr, 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 grr. That's not us yelling, that's not us screaming.
This was a bug that Blizzard decided not to fix as it was too late by the time they'd notice. Then after that, we had another BlizzCon thing, this time giving a toy instead of a pet called the Murloc costume. Using this, put on a horribly made Murloc costume wielding a BlizzCon flag.
That's us crying!
And lastly, we had a whopping 3 TCG expansions with loot cards in them. Through the Dark Portal contained a toy picnic basket, a pet banana charm that summoned a pet monkey, and an Impinaball toy acting like a magic 8-ball. Then we got the Fires of Outland expansion that had a Goblin Gumbo Kettle toy, a Fishing Chair toy, and the legendary Reigns of the Swift Spectral Tiger mount, going for a whopping $8,000 these days. Then, lastly, March of the Legion. This had a paper flying machine, a rocket chicken pet, and the dragon kite pet. As you can see, the TCG really has started to kick up the amount of items on this list. Eventually, in BlizzCon Online 2021, they gave out a similar Nether Drake Welt pet, again as a promotion for TBC Classic as part of one of their bundles, in reminiscent of the TBC Collector's Edition. Anyways, lastly, for the year 2007, we got the name change character surface added to the store. 2008, the year of Wrath of the Lich King, and of course, the Wrath of the Lich King's Collector's Edition, containing the pet Frosty, a little skeletal dragon whelp. And for this year's BlizzCon, we got the Blizzard Bear mount, with a small baby Murloc on its back waving a BlizzCon flag. But wait, we also had this thing called the World of Warcraft Invitational, a big WoW tournament separate from BlizzCon. And this year, if you traveled there and bought a ticket, you would get the Tyrael's Hilt, that summoned a small Tyrael companion from Diablo. This was the only reward ever from this event, as soon after the event would just be merged into BlizzCon. Next, of course, we have the TCG rewards, another 3 expansions, the Servants of the Betrayer, which contain the Goblin Weather Machine toy, the X51 Nether Rocket Extreme mount. Funnily enough, it's the mount used for Wowhead's icon. And lastly, the Papa Hummel's Pet Biscuits, allowing you to double your companion pet size. And this was actually a consumable, and you only got 50 of them from the loot card, so you could eventually just run out. Although this card was rather common, so it was not too much of a deal. Although they later on added an in-game item that can be obtained that did exactly the same thing. So save the money, go to the Timeless Isle and buy some, or just do pet battle events as they drop like candy from pet loot bags you obtain from all forms of pet battle content. Next, we have the Hunt for Illidan expansion, giving you the Disco toy, the Soul Trade Beacon, which summoned an ethereal pet, actually acting as a vendor, just not one you could sell anything to, and while summoned, allowing you to gather a special currency for killing things that is used to buy stuff from the vendor, a cosmetic set that looks like ethereal bandages, some neat stuff like alcohol, and a ball to throw to your friends, or alter your companion's appearance, and the biggest thing being a potion that allowed you to see lesser invisibility. This could possibly be seen as pay to win, but it's not. And then the Path of the Illidan, another consumable item. This left a fail trail behind you for 5 minutes, and came with 100 charges. Lastly, the Drums of War expansion, which contained the Flag of the Ownership toy, the Big Battle Bear mount, and 100 party grenades, an item they made pretty easy to get in-game later on in WoW. You can see a bit of a trend now. They are adding a few consumable items. However, as the TCG was later discontinued, Blizzard added these consumable items to the game as a way to get them even after the cards have long since disappeared. 2009, the 5th anniversary of WoW's release. At this point, we really start to see the microtransactions speed up, so we better get through these quick. Our first ever virtual BlizzCon. Now finally people can get BlizzCon goodies without traveling across the world for a few days and paying insane costs. And for buying this ticket, you got Grunty, a Murloc in a StarCraft Marine armor. We also got the new character services, faction change, a race change. We also got another 3 TCG expansions, the Blood of the Gladiators containing the Sandbox Tiger toy, another consumable toy, Epic Purple Shirt, and a Foam Sword Rack toy. The Fields of Honor expansion containing the Path of Sonaris, an item like the Trail of Illidan but flowers instead of Fell Flame, the Ogre Pinata toy, and the Magic Rooster mount. And the Scourge Wear expansion, the Tuskar Kite pet, the Spectral Tiger Cub pet, and the Little White Stallion mount for Alliance, or Little Ivory Raptor for Horde. But wait, it's not actually a mount. It was a mount, but each time you mounted onto it, it would consume one of its charges and only came with 50 charges. Maybe the only consume on use mount in history. Or I guess there's also the Winter's Veil reindeers, those also count. But before we move on to 2010, there is one more thing they added, the virtual store. This is a store we still have to this day, although originally not in-game, it was on their website, later moved to in-game. The store launched with the little phylactery, summoning a little KT pet, and the Pandaren monk pet. However, the Pandaren monk pet launched with a new charity event where people would buy the pet and 100% of the money earned would go to the charity of Blizzard's choice, allowing players to donate to charities and be rewarded for it with a pet in their favorite game. Then, in the year of 2010, Cataclysm is released in this year, and with it, the little Deathwing pet coming from its collector's edition, as well as the Murloc Deathwing hybrid pet, Deathy, coming from BlizzCon. We also got a ton of new things added to the Warcraft store, a little Ragnaros pet, a little XT pet, and a Moonkin hatchling pet, bringing back the charity event pet. Also the infamous Celestial Steed mount. This mount caused all kinds of backlash when it was released, as it was the first real store mount, and just straight up had advantages over in-game mounts. Its speed changed along with your training, which no other pets did at the time. It would gain the ability to fly when you unlocked flying, and it could be obtained on all of your alts instead of just one character. So it was the first mount a lot of player alts would have since it was free for them, and was seen everywhere in low-level battlegrounds because of it. And then again, another 3 TCG expansions. The Wrathgate, containing the Instant Statue Pedestal toy, the Blazing Hippogriff mount, and Landro's Gift Box. This box was very common, although it's now very expensive, because it was WoW's very first loot crate, I guess you could call it. It always contained a Sandbox Tiger, or Pet Biscuit, or Path of Cenarius, although it could also contain a Spectral Tiger, a Swift Spectral Tiger, an X51 Nether Rocket Extreme, and a special blue version simply called the X51 Nether Rocket, as well as a Big Battle Bear, or a Riding Turtle. Some would almost call this WoW's version of gambling, although buying the TCG packs themselves could also be called such, so funny enough, through the art on this card, it included a ton of past loot card references on it, although most of the things visible in the card art are not actually obtainable from the box. Next, we have the Icecrown TCG expansion containing the first ever unique Hearthstone, a toy called the Ethereal Portal. Then the woolly white Rhino mount, and a consumable Paint Bombs, again 50 charges per card. Then lastly, the Worldbreaker expansion, which had a Grim Campfire toy, the modeled Drake mount, and Landros Little XT. The exact same pet that was available on the in-game store for 8 months at this point, but with a different name? Why they did this, I'm not super sure. 2011 was quite a unique year for WoW microtransactions. First, we got the Merkablow, a hybrid Diablo Murloc pet from BlizzCon, guild services in the manner of faction transfers, realm transfers, and name change, allowing people to change entire guilds, especially with the new guild progression system, meaning guilds actually meant something now with achievements and levels and such. Then as usual, 3 TCG expansions. War of the Elements, containing the War Party Hitching Post, a toy you place that let players click on it to mount on a horse. Then the Savage Raptor mount, and the Landros Lichling pet. Again, just like Little XT, this pet was the same one available on the in-game store, but was now also made obtainable randomly from a card pack, with also technically a different name. Then we have the Twilight of the Dragons, Nightsaber Cub Companion, Fool's Gold toy, allowing people to click on it to summon a Kobold Companion for a bit, and the Amani Dragonhawk mount. Lastly, the Thrones of Tides expansion, seemingly named after the cancelled raid for Cataclysm. It contained the Purple Puffer pet, a sack of starfish toy that lets you throw starfishes onto your friend's face, and the Swift Shore Strider mount. That's a lot of microtransactions, isn't it? We are almost halfway there. In the in-game store, we also got the Winged Guardian mount and the Cenarian Hatchling pet. This time a companion from the TCG being added to the store, instead of the other way around. And lastly, we got the Guardian Cub Companion pet. This pet was unique that this pet could be bought in the in-game store for real cash, and then be traded in-game, and even sold on the auction house, and was removed 3 years later, meaning there is a limited amount of these now in the game, and they were bought for real money and traded for gold. Acting almost as WoW's token does today, except it's a pet and not WoW time or BNet balance. It was Blizzard's first attempt to try and have a way to pay real money from the online store to convert it into gold in game through the auction house, which wasn't as successful as they probably hoped. Now we move over to 2012, first year in a long time with no BlizzCon, so we move right away to the TCG packs, with the Crown of Heavens first, a magical ogre idol toy, Grail Moss pet, and the Corrupted Hippogriff mount. Next, we have the Tomb of the Forgotten War, which had the Spurious Sarcophagus toy, the Sanscara pet, and the White Riding Camel mount. Then, the War of the Ancients expansions, the Demon Hunter's Aspect toy, allowing you to play a Demon Hunter only about 4 years early, the Eye of the Legion pet, and the Feldrake mount. 2012 was also the year we got the Mists of Pandaria Collector's Edition, which not only had the pet being the lucky Quillian cub, but also a mount to match in the Imperial Quillet. Then the in-game store, we got the Cinder Kitten pet, being the charity event pet for the year, Soul of the Aspects pet, and the Heart of the Aspects mount, one of the most annoying flying mounts to ever use in-game. And lastly, we got a very special mount. This mount was called Tyrael's Charger, based on Tyrael from Diablo 3. This mount was granted to players who signed up for the annual subscription to WoW, and as a bonus for doing so, they got this mount, as well as Diablo 3 for free, and even access to the Mists of Pandaria beta. As you would guess, this promo only lasted for 6 months, and this type of promo was pretty well received, and would see a return some years later. 2013, a very special year. BlizzCon is back, and this time with Murgalot, based on a Murloc version of the new Crusader class in Diablo 3, who was also one of the only good microtransaction pets when it came to pet battles later on. Surprisingly, all of the best pets in pet battles are usually very easy to obtain in-game, with Murgalot being the lone exception until they nerfed it in Shadowlands. We also were saying goodbye to Mercamus the Gladiator. This Gladiator Murloc pet was made available in 2009 and was gifted to players who completed 200 duels in the special arena tournament servers. These servers were open for a limited time each year and cost money to access them. Then in 2010 it was lowered to 50. Another bonus was the Vanquisher title, a title granted to those who were in the top 1,000 teams on the server. A title that, like the pet, transferred to the normal realms as well. And with these servers going away for the final time in 2013, they were gone. Another thing going away in 2013 was the TCG, with one final expansion, Betrayal of the Guardian, the Gusting Remor pet, the Dark Portal Hearthstone, and the Ghastly Charger mount. And there we go, that's the end of the TCG. Thank Lord, cause 9 new items every year from the TCG alone was way too much to list for this video. Now, onto the in-game store. Seemingly to make up for the lack of 2 TCG expansions, they put more things onto the store itself. First, the Alteric Brandy Bernard Companion, which was part of a charity event for the year, the Enchanted Fey Dragon mount, the Blossoming Ancient pet, which is a special Trent that changes appearances with the real-life seasons, the Armored Bloodwing mount, Swift Windsteed mount, and our first ever transmog of the in-game store, the Crown of Eternal Winter, Hood of Hungering Darkness, and the Jewel of the Fire Lord, which were so poorly received they didn't try putting transmog on the store again for another 7 years. 2014, WoW's 10th anniversary and the release of Warlords of Draenor. This year introduced the character boost, allowing people to instantly get to level 90, which at the time of release was max level. Although once Warlords of Draenor released, was only now high enough level to get started in the expansion. It also came with the Dread Raven mount and matching pet. BlizzCon that year, to match the expansion, came out with the Grom Hellscream Murloc. And well, the store only got a few items. The Argy pet, which was part of that yearly charity event, the Grinning Reaver mount, Iron Sky Reaver mount, and the Warforged Nightmare mount, which came with the Hitching Post toy. Much like the Hitching Post earlier from the TCG, it allowed friends to click on it in order to get a temporary version of the mount. For how much people complained about the store mounts in this year, since they believe those WoD aesthetic mounts should have been rewards from WoD content, it was actually quite a light year in terms of microtransactions. Now into 2015. First, we have the Mercadin, a Demon Hunter Murloc given by BlizzCon, as well as Nimbles, the Fellstalker pet, and the Illidari Fellstalker mount from the Legion Collector's Edition. Then Brightpaw, the magical cat pet, which was part of the charity event for the year, and the Mystic Runesaber mount. And lastly, the biggest thing ever added to WoW's microtransactions, the WoW token. This item was able to be bought with real money and put onto the auction house, which then could be bought for gold by other players, who could then consume it to gain 30 days of game time. Yes, WoW was finally adding a 100% direct version of trading real money for gold, and the player base has been very vocally upset about it ever since, even if it is a very popular addition to the game that is very widely used. Now into 2016, we have 2 Murloc pets, each based on the factions, a Horde Murloc and an Alliance Murloc, both from BlizzCon. And Mischief, a Fel-corrupted pet that was the charity event pet of the year. And that's it. Yeah, that's all there is for 2016. Probably the lightest year ever in terms of microtransactions. For 2017, we got another year of faction-themed rewards, this time 2 mounts, an airship for Alliance and Zeppelin for Horde, celebrating faction war at BlizzCon. We got 3 things added to the in-game store, the charity event pet of the year, Shadow the Fox pet, the Luminous Star Seeker mount, and a cat pet called Twilight. There was 2 special things that also happened this year. First, the WoW token could now be exchanged for BattleNet balance instead of WoW time. Costing $20 to purchase it, it could be exchanged for $15 or 1 month of game time. And lastly, the Asian servers had a special event to celebrate the Chinese New Year. For the Year of the Rooster, anyone who did a special subscription promo got the Magical Rooster mount. Meaning technically, in Asian servers, the Riding Turtle was no longer the only TCG mount now obtainable through other means, although the Riding Turtle was still the only one obtainable for free in-game. Also, the Tyrell's Charger mount was made available on Asian servers in their in-game store, since they did not get the same promo the rest of the world did. So on to 2018. For this year's BlizzCon, giving you a special transmog cape based on your faction, for a Horde or Alliance, as well as a banner toy, again based on your faction. To pair with this faction conflict, we got Battle for Azeroth Collector's Edition. This came with a mount also based on your faction, a Zandalai Raptor for Horde, and a Kulturon Steed for Alliance, and a Tottle, the Tortollan pet. We also got the Captain Cracker parrot pet on the in-game store, and this year's charity event was Whomper the Yeti. There was also the Vulpine Familiar and Shunzen, a dog mount calibrating the Year of the Dog. This mount was simply purchased on the store. However, in the Asian servers, like the Rooster the year before, it was earned for free through a special subscription package. Lastly, like the Magical Rooster and Shenzhou for Asia, the rest of the world was about to get a free mount the same way they got the Tyrell's Charger. By buying a 6-month sub, they could get the Dreadwake mount for free, or they could buy it from the store itself if they did not want to pay for a 6-month subscription. Now on to 2019 and WoW's 15th year anniversary. This brought 3 new mounts with it, the Alabaster Griffin and Wyvern based on your faction. These mounts were available from the in-game store and as part of the physical collector's edition celebrating 15 years. And for the 4th and final year in a row, BlizzCon gave another faction-based reward, this time a pet Murloc based on Anduin and Sylvanas, alongside a special transmog set, a pair of Yeti pajamas. They also released another mount for the Chinese New Year, Hogress, yet again a 6-month promo for China, but for the rest of the world, a simple store mount. Another special thing they did this year was add 2 toys to the in-game shop. These 2 toys were released on the store with the promise of their profits going to the prize pool for tournaments, although this had a lot of its own issues in the community, which they rightly called them out for. The toys being the Transmorpher and the Faction Fireworks. Lastly, we had the Dottie pet added to the store, which was this year's charity event pet, and another 6-month subscription reward mount added, the Silverian Dreamer. Now on to 2020, the year of, well, Shadowlands, the most recent expansion and a new, much larger collector's edition, containing multiple versions with more rewards than the last. It had a special weapon enchant called Wrathchill, armor set called Vestments of the Eternal Traveler, the Everworm mount, Eternal Traveler Hearthstone, and Anima Wormling pet. On top of that, something to mention is that Mista Pandaria was the first expansion to have a digital collector's edition. However, after some time it was removed from the online store. But every expansion since has stayed on the online store. And so with 2020, they returned the Pandaren pet and mount to the store. Next, we have 2 more mounts, both of them yet again 6-month sub promos. The Steam Scale Incinerator, and finally, the Chinese New Year mounts, which would also be made a 6-month sub promo for the whole world, making the next 6-month sub mount Squeakers, a rat for that year of the rat. But before we move on, there was one more 6-month promo that year, in the Spirit Darter costume. This transmog set is the first full set put on the store, and like the Steam Scale and Squeakers, it was given free to people who had a 6-month sub going on, or available on the store for everyone else. And just like with the transmog hood 7 years prior, was met with a lot of backlash. Well, technically, all 6-month promos and store mounts are met with backlash, but the transmog items got way more, as it's seen as a lesser item than mounts to most players. Funny enough, there is almost 0 backlash for transmog items that come with BlizzCon rewards. And now, 2021. We already have 2 mounts, the Lucky Yoon Ox from the Year of the Ox 6-month promo, and the Snowstorm Bear from the BlizzCon Virtual Goodie Bundle, as 2020's BlizzCon was postponed and made entirely free and virtual, with the usual goodies being added as a bonus bundle. This bundle also giving the Moonwell pet, an alternate color version of the TBC Collector's Edition pet. Lastly, at BlizzCon 2021-2020, Whatever it's meant to be, they announced 2 new charity pets, this time changing it up a bit to make it much more player-friendly. Players can donate any amount they want, as little or as much as they want, and by doing so, they add to a donation pool, which when it reaches a specific amount, gives all players the Bananas Monkey pet, which is originally from the TCG, to all players, even those who did not donate, as well as a new pet called Daisy the Sloth if the donations reach a stretch goal. Then giving all players donated or not 2 new pets, basically for free, but also basically still a microtransaction. Now, before we end, there is something else to mention. Blizzard has many games, and they love to have their games cross over. And for all these collector's editions of WoW games, they also give rewards for the other games, like StarCraft 2, Overwatch, Heroes of the Storm, Hearthstone, and Diablo 3. However, those games also cross over into WoW. So quickly, StarCraft 2 Collector's Edition, you got the Mini Thor pet. StarCraft 2 Heart of the Swarm got you the Baneling pet. StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void got you the Zeradar Archon pet. Diablo 3 got you the Fetish Shaman pet. Diablo 3 Reaper of Souls got you the Treasure Goblin pet. And Overwatch's Collector's Edition got you the Baby Winston pet in WoW. And now we are done. That is all the microtransactions in all of WoW that we could find. Something to note is that if you go off the actual list, the amount of microtransactions has drastically gone down over the past few years. Although many people did not know about many of the things, as 2006 to 2013 was filled with stuff. And as of recent years, we're returning to a more manageable amounts, especially with these mounts that are given for free to people who either already have a 6-month sub or purchase one during their promotion. Well, as free as an incentive to pay for a long sub is anyway. In this video, we're going to be going over the history of raiding, from Vanilla WoW all the way to Shadowlands and everything in between. Starting off with the launch of Vanilla WoW, where there was 2 raids immediately, both out on November 23rd, 2004, Onyxia's Lair and Molten Core, and at the moment, raids were 40-man only, requiring a full 40-man raid to combat the forces of evil. Both had their own attunements, Molten Core only a single quest, with Onyxia being a massive quest line. However, Onyxia went down first, surprisingly enough. 69 days after launch, it was killed for the first time. And Ragnaros was killed 154 days after launch. Within the caverns of Molten Core laid 3 legendaries. A special necklace that dropped for 1 single person before being removed, as well as the parts to craft 2 far less unique but still awesome legendaries, the Sulphurous Hammer of Ragnaros and the Thunder Fury Blessed Blade of the Windseeker. 2 months later, Blackwing Lair released, July 12th. Another attunement, but much shorter this time. However, it would not be cleared until after Zul'Gurub, first 20-man raid in the game. Introduced in September 13, 2005, which was cleared the day of its release. Within its walls, a Raptor and Tiger mounts randomly dropped from their bosses, followed by Blackwing Lair finally being cleared 13 days later on September 26, 2005. 3 months later, the lands of Silithus would be transformed forever. The Temple of Ahn'Qiraj would become, well, unlocked. Players then needed to work together to unlock the raid by performing massive quest lines and ringing the gong as a Scarab's Lord, to then battle the forces of the Old Gods for 10 hours. And then the temple would be attacked, first off with the ruins of Ahn'Qiraj. The 20-man raid Smaller Wing would be cleared first day of openings of the gates, on the 23rd of January 2006. However, Cthulhu at the end of the temple, the 40-man wing of the raid, would not go down for 3 months, on the 25th of April in 2006. Within its Chittering Caverns, the red, blue, green, and yellow Karaji battle tanks were obtainable. These special mounts were only usable inside the raid, though. And now, for the final raid of Vanilla, and the final ever 40-man raid to be added to the game, the legendary Naxxramas, opening on June 20th, 2006. Players would exchange materials, less and less based on the reputation levels with the Argent Crusade, in order to gain access to the raid. And, well, how long did it take? A massive 90 days for Kel'Thuzad to finally fall to the hands of Nihilum. On September 7th, followed not too long after by the release of the Burning Crusade, only 4 months later in January of 2007. So, not many guilds had the chance to down the place, especially with the announcement of the expansion resetting players' progress. Many players simply quit, or did not bother to raid, knowing their progress would end up basically pointless. However, within this raid, players were able to gather the pieces to then craft the legendary Atiesh, limited to Druid, Mage, Warlock, and Priest, although a slightly different version of the same staff for each class. The Burning Crusade launched with many raids as compared to most other expansions. At release, in the same day of January 16, was Gruul's Lair, Magtheridon's Lair, Serpentride Caverns, Tempest Keep, Karazhan, and the Battle for Mount Hyjal. Karazhan, the longest of the launch raids, was the first to go down. With only 10 players allowed in the raid, it was killed only 12 days after the launch of the expansion, in January 28, 2007. With the raid dropping his mount Midnight from Atum rarely. The remaining raids at TBC would mostly be 25-man. Blizzard moving away from the 40-man raid style, favoring a new 25-man system, although with the odd 10-man here and there. Gruul's Lair was killed 19 days after the launch of the expansion, with him dying on the 2nd of February. Magtheridon went down after 40 days on the 24th of February in 2007, and was one of the longest raid fights in the game's history. Serpentrine, however, as its attunement required, was long and time-consuming, and the raid actually having more than 1 or 2 bosses, it did not fall until the 29th of March, 73 days after launch, in big part to the last boss being extremely buggy. Now into the Tempest Keep, the Eye. This raid's final boss, Kael'thas, was a very unique boss fight, with the players looting temporary legendary gear mid-fight to use for the remainder of the fight. These items being the Cosmic Infuser, Devastation, Netherstand Bow, and to fire from the Nether Spikes, Phase Shift Bulwark, Warp Slicer, and the Staff of Disintegration. However, even with all these legendaries, the fight was deemed unkillable because of his very buggy nature, and would not be until the Black Temple was released, which was on the 22nd of May, fixing many of the bugs on Kael'thas, meaning he was finally killed 130 days after launch of the raid, on May 25th, 2007, having a chance to drop his Phoenix mount Alar. And with his death, players could finally enter Mount Hyjal, which, while available since launch, it is hard to count it as such since it was locked behind killing Kael'thas, so its days to kill is counted from Black Temple's launch. However, even though this raid was quote-unquote available since launch, and much smaller than Black Temple, it would not be the first to be cleared. Illidan was such a fan favorite that players rushed to kill the legendary Demon Hunter. Black Temple was cleared 21 days from its launch, within its walls dropping the legendary Warglaze from Illidan's Stormrage himself, followed by Mount Hyjal being killed 26 days later. Zul'Aman was then released and cleared on the day of November 13, 2007, the second 10-man raid of TBC, and the last ever 10-man only raid of WoW. However, this raid had a special event. If complete within a specific amount of time, the players could loot the Amani Warbear, which was removed come Wrath of the Lich King, not wanting it to become too easy to get. Following that, the last raid of the Burning Crusade, and the last ever 25-man only raid ever, would be opened, the Sunwell Plateau on March 25th, 2008, with the legendary Thoradel bow dropping from the final boss Kil'jaeden, which was forced back through the portal for the first time on May 25th, 2008, exactly 1 year after his minion Kael'thas was killed in the Tempest Keep. Wrath of the Lich King released November 13th, 2008, introducing a new raiding system, and with this raid could be done in 10-man groups or 25-man groups, the 25-man raids having slightly better gear than the 10-man versions, usually being seen as the superior version, of course. So, World First Kills will only be counted for 25-man. The expansion launched with the Vault of Archivon, a remastered Naxxramas, Obsidian Sanctum, and Eye of Eternity. It would not take long at all, with Naxxramas and the Eye of Eternity and the Vault of Archivon all being cleared in only 2 days on November 15th. The Eye of Eternity containing the Azure Drake and the Blue Drake, while the Vault of Archivon contained the 3-person mount, the Grand Black War Mammoth, a blue one for Alliance and red for Horde. Part of the reason these were killed so quickly was because gear from Sunwell Plateau was still pretty good in early Wrath of the Lich King. This was something they fixed later on in expansions where previous gear from previous expansions were no longer good enough to be good during entry-level raids. The other raid, Sartharion 3 Drakes, taking until the 21st of November to die. Sartharion is a dragon within a single room. Besides him is 3 smaller dragon mini-bosses that need to be killed before engaging him. However, if the raid pulled the boss and killed him without killing the dragons, they would join in on the fight. And if the boss was then killed, a special achievement and bonus loot including a dragon mount would pop up. The Black Drake in 10-man and the Twilight Drake in 25-man. Next was Ulduar, releasing April 14th, 2009, containing the legendary Mace Valdir, with the raid also making the most use of the hard mode mechanic compared to any other raid in the game's history. We have a whole video on these if you want to learn more about them, but I'll go over them quickly here. By doing something specific during or before the fight, the raid can activate a harder version of that fight, which would just make the fight harder, giving extra special loot for killing the boss in that manner, and also sometimes extra bosses. Algalon the Observer requiring the players to kill a few of the bosses in hard mode to unlock. However, the biggest achievement was killing Yogg-Saron without the help of any of the keepers. Quite the difficult feat, as the fight is very obviously designed around the keepers helping you with the fight, which was known as Yogg-Saron plus 0 or Yogg-Saron 0 lights. It took players 85 days to kill the Mouthy clan with no lights, all the way to July 7, 2009. Dropping the Mimiron's head mount, guaranteed to drop 1 per kill, at least until the Cataclysm pre-patch where it became a random drop. In the very next raid, they introduced some new mechanics, the heroic mode. These versions of the raid gave even stronger loot while also just being harder. And to pair, they added a limited attempt counter. While in heroic, any wipes would count that counter, and if you ran out of attempts, you would need to wait till the next week to be able to try again. With the Trial of the Crusader even having a special achievement for killing the entire raid without a single wipe, rewarding the players with a unique Crusader horse in 25-man or a horse/wolf for 10-man depending on your faction, all retired with the Cataclysm's launch. So with the Trial of the Grand Crusader launching on August 4th, 2009, its heroic would have been cleared soon, except for the fact that its heroic mode did not actually open until September 1st, 2009, almost a month later, finally letting players attempt heroic versions of the raid. So how long did it take? Well, around 7 days, with the new Barak going down September 7th, followed shortly after by the return of Onyxia. Blizzard, in celebration of 5 years of WoW, brought back the legendary dragon in a new 10/25-man version that was killed the exact same day she came out on September 22nd, having a chance to drop the Onyxia Drake, a mount version of the dragon herself. Outside of Onyxia's lair, every raid after Trial of the Grand Crusader would follow the same system of normal/heroic 10/25-man modes.
Let them come. Frostmourne hungers.
Icecrown Citadel, where players crafted the legendary Shadowmourne after a long, raid-wide questline to combat the legendary Frostmourne wielded by Arthas the Lich King. Releasing in December 2009 on the 8th, it would take a while to clear the raid, as the raid needed to be cleared on normal before it could be cleared on heroic, and with the raid having a massive time gate of releasing a new wing every couple of weeks, heroic mode would not open until 2 months after the launch of Icecrown, on the 9th of February. Finally able to enter the raid on heroic, it took players 46 days to finally put the Lich King himself down, on March 26, 2010. Dropping the infamous invisible mount Invincible, a guaranteed drop once per kill, at least until the Cataclysm pre-patch. And just over a month later, the raid Ruby Sanctum, a single boss raid getting players ready story-wise for the Cataclysm, would release and be killed the same day on June 30th. Now, before we move on from Wrath of the Lich King, we must talk about achievements. With their introduction, many raid fights would get simple achievements for killing bosses. However, from now on, any raids added would get new special achievements. These achievements are gifted for doing unique things during a fight, with various challenges, some making fights harder, some not really being anything other than doing the fight really well. But completing these achievements usually gave nothing but a bit of achievement points to show off to your friends. However, there was one thing: meta achievements. By completing all of the special achievements for a raid, you would be granted a special mount. For example, completing all of the special achievements for all of the bosses in Old War 10-man would give you the Rusted Protodrake mount, while 25-man would give you the Ironbound Protodrake. The same style reward was in the remastered Naxxramas, giving the Plagued and Black Protodrake. However, they were made unobtainable come Old War's launch, something they decided to stop doing after this, as it seemingly did not go over well, as the Old War mounts and all those meta achievement mounts to follow would stay obtainable. So for those that have meta achievement mounts, we'll list them in the video. For example, Icecrown Citadel had the Undead Frostdrake mounts. December 7th, 2010. The Cataclysm would release with some raid changes. First off, the limited attempt mechanic was removed, and the rest of the changes would come later. With the launch, there was 3 raids: Bastion of Twilight, Blackwing Descent, and the Throne of Four Winds. Blackwing Descent would be the first to be cleared on January 9th, 27 days after launch. Bastion of Twilight would be next on the 20th of January 2011, 38 days after launch. The first ever raid to have a heroic-only boss. In normal, the final boss is Cho'Gall, however in heroic mode, players would be pitted against the new heroic-only boss, Sinestra. This kill was followed shortly after by the Throne of Four Winds at 42 days, this raid having a chance to drop the Drake of the South Wind mount. And doing the meta achievement for all 3 of these raids, the players would be gifted the Drake of the East Wind mount. Buried in Hold was also in at launch and was meant as a replacement for world bosses, locked behind PvP world zones, and a new boss added with each new patch, all just like the Vault of Archivon, cleared day of course. The next raid to come out would be Firelands on June 28th, containing our Firelord Ragnaros once again. And also, after completing a long questline for it, the Dragonwrath staff, a staff which had a unique effect that allowed you to transform into a Dragonflight mount, which you still need to have the staff equipped in order to do that, as they didn't turn it into a toy or something for players that were able to obtain it. The Lord of Fire Ragnaros himself would not be killed once and for all until July 19th, 2011, only 14 days after its launch. The raid had 2 mounts it could drop: the Pureblood Firehawk from Ragnaros, which is a guaranteed drop if killed on Heroic mode before the Mist of Pandaria pre-patch, and the Flame Talon of Alice Razor, which was a rare drop from the Alice Razor fight, followed by the Corrupted Firehawk gifted to players for completing the Glory of the Firelands Raider meta achievement. And now for the big one, Dragon Soul, releasing November 29th and containing the Twin Blades of the Dragon Prince, a rather cool pair of daggers for rogues crafted with the help of Wrathion, the son of Deathwing. And this raid contained a ton of mounts. First, the Twilight Harbinger given to players who did the raid's meta achievement, and 3 mount drops: the Lifebinder's Handmaiden from Heroic Deathwing, guaranteed 1 drop per kill until Mist of Pandaria pre-patch, the Blazewing Drake randomly from Noric and Heroic Deathwing, and Experiment 12B randomly from Ultraxion. And enough about the good parts, let's talk about some of the issues. First off, the raid was seen as rather poor, with some awkward boss fights and some right-out horrible ones. It didn't take long to die though, dying December 20th, only 14 days after launch. And yeah, the dates do not add up. 20th of December is not 14 days after the 29th of November, but again, that's because players needed to unlock Heroic first. So the first week they did normal to then unlock Heroic week 2. So that is where it and others are counted from. But the real problem was LFR, a new difficulty mode introduced in the game. This mode was very easy and quite time-gated, with its wings coming out week by week, later nerfed to a new wing every 2 weeks. It also gave weaker gear than normal, but the problem was that it gave the tier set bonuses, and could be combined with other difficulty tier set bonuses versions in order to get the 2 and 4 set. And the tier set bonuses in Dragon Soul were some of the strongest in the game's history. And there was this little old exploit you could do in LFR, where you could only personally loot the bosses once a week. However, other people in the raid could trade you gear as long as you participated in the fight. So, top raiders were stacking LFR with alts, and just having them win the rolls and trade all their gear to the main raiders, giving them all a full 4 set bonus as soon as Heroic started. And so many top guilds were banned because of this, and also because of this, Blizzard nerfed LFR heavily in the following expansions, not wanting high-end players to feel they needed to do LFR, or especially that they needed to exploit it. Oh, and also, meta achievements could not be completed in LFR, so you could do them only in normal Heroic, but it was best to do them in normal, as that was the easiest way to make sure you can get them done. With the downfall of Deathwing, we enter Pandaria, September 25th, 2012. For the first time ever, the raids were not available at launch, giving players time to level before releasing the raids, not wanting to worry as much about leveling being a major part of the World First race. And so, the first raid, Mogushan's Vault, was released on October 2nd. And so, week 1, of course, normal raid was cleared, which leads to week 2, the Heroic final boss only dying 3 days after it became available, dying on October 12th, 2012. Within this raid was Elegon, a Celestial Cloud Serpent that dropped a Celestial Cloud Serpent mount, of course. Following that, the Heart of Fear would release on October 30th, 2012, with yet again another short race. Week 1 normal clear, week 2 Heroic being cleared in only 5 days on November 11th. Terrace of Endless Spring would be released on November 13th, then being cleared in 5 days once Heroic became available, the Shot of Fear falling on November 25th. Completing the meta achievements for all these raids granted the players the Heavenly Crimson Cloud Serpent. However, also clearing all the raid bosses in Heroic as a guild unlocked the Thundering Jade Cloud Serpent mount, to be purchasable from the guild's vendor for 3,000 gold. And then on March 5th, we would be gifted with the amazing raid Throne of Thunder, with yet again another Heroic-only final boss, that being Raw Dead, and the return of the limited attempt system. The raid was called completed 14 days after Heroic opened on March 26th, but then Raw Den was taken out afterwards by a fair bit too, not dying until April 11th, 2013, taking over 2 weeks. And for completing this raid's meta achievement, they were rewarded with the Armored Sky Screamer. But for killing the bosses in the raid, you had 2 mounts you could obtain as rare drops: the Spawn of Horadon from Horadon, and the Clutch of Jikun from Jikun. Now into the Siege of Orgrimmar, launching September 10th, it only took 14 days after Heroic unlocked to kill Garrosh, on the 1st of October, although 11 of the 14 bosses in the raid died in only the first 2 days, meaning the other 12 days was spent on the last 3 bosses of the raid. The meta achievement gave the Spawn of Galakras mount, and the Kor'kron Juggernaut mount a guaranteed drop from the hardest difficulty of Garrosh, changed with the Warlords of Draenor pre-patch to a random drop in the hardest difficulty. But we're not done yet. Siege of Orgrimmar introduced a few new systems. First off, the Ahead of the Curve achievement. This achievement was granted to players who killed Garrosh in normal mode or better before the release of Warlords of Draenor pre-patch. This achievement granted players the Kor'kron Warwolf, which meant once Warlords of Draenor pre-patch came out, the mount was no longer available. The other thing was the Flex mode. Easier than normal, but harder than LFR. This version of the raid could be done in any amount of players from 10 to 30, scaling the difficulty of the bosses to better suit your raid, meaning you no longer had the issue of having 20 players and either pugging, not raiding, or splitting into two 10-man groups. This would not last long though, as the final change is the one that came in the pre-patch for Warlords of Draenor. They reworked all of the raid difficulties. LFR stayed the same, actually, but Flex was renamed to Normal and stayed the same. Normal was renamed to Heroic, and now worked the same way as Flex did, but just as a harder difficulty. While Heroic was renamed to Mythic. This difficulty was rather unchanged, staying the hardest mode, and staying a static number of raiding. However, Mythic raiding was limited to 20 people, meaning no more 25-man raiding and no more 10-man raiding in the hardest difficulty. If you want to do the hardest content, you had to have 20 people. No more, no less. However, with all of the other difficulties, as long as you had more than 10 players and less than 30, you could raid, and that is a system that would stay to this very day. Before we move on, I'm sure you noticed a lack of legendaries. Well, from now on, mostly legendaries would be earned through all sorts of content. Part to do with raids, but mostly just earned all over the place. World content, questing, crafting, and even PvP. But raids were not the main focus of where you obtained the legendaries anymore. Especially as legendaries were no longer something a couple few would get. They were now something every single person was pretty much guaranteed to get as long as they completed their own quest lines with their personal loot. No longer having to fight against fellow raiders for random raid drops to craft their legendaries, or roll for rare drops. Now on to Warlords of Draenor, releasing November 13th, High Maul in his first raid was released December 2nd, with Mythic not releasing until the 9th, as like Heroic of the past, Mythic would not open till a week after the raid's launch. And so with Mythic launching the 9th of December, the final boss, Imperator Margok, was killed only 4 days later, on the 13th of December 2014. The second raid of the expansion, Blackrock Foundry, releasing February 3rd, 2015, and the legendary fight Blackhand would survive only 10 days, dying on the 20th of February. This raid was a return to glory, being well known as the best raid of the expansion, especially with such an amazing fight as Blackhand. Completing both of these raids while in a guild unlocked the Black Steel Battle Boar, while completing the meta achievement version of the fights granted everyone the Gore Strider Gronling. And for mount drops, the Iron Hoof Destroyer, a massive cleft hoof coated with burning wood and metal, dropping on Mythic only as a random drop. And now on to the final raid for Draenor. Yeah, that was quick. Hellfire Citadel, launching June 23rd, with Archimonde dying 16 days after the Mythic version of the raid opening. This place has 3 mounts. First off, the Infernal Direwolf for the meta achievement. Second off, the Grove Warden for the Ahead of the Curve achievement mount, which was removed in the preparation for Legion. And the Felsteel Annihilator dropping from Mythic Archimonde. Again, a guaranteed dropped until it was lowered to 1% come the next expansion. Now, on to Legion's final invasion of Azeroth with Legion. Launching August 30th, its first raid, Emerald Nightmare, would not be released until many weeks later on September 20th. And how long did it take for its mythic final boss to go down? 18 hours. Most world-first raid groups got to Cenarius, the second to last boss, and assuming Xavius would be really difficult, they moved to Heroic to do more farm and collect more gear to help them. But the winners, Exorus, said F it, and instead decided to give it a shot and, well, it died really quick, and was snatched away from Midwinter and Easy, who were on the task to get it. According to some world-first raiders, a reason Xavius went down so fast was because of Mythic Plus gear being so good at the start of the expansion. Because it was then when that system was released for the first time, and they hadn't figured out how to not make the gear super good for Mythic raiding yet. The next raid, Trial of Valor, came out November 8th, and took only 3 days after Mythic Unlocked to die. It died on the 18th of November 2016. And while the raid did not drop anything super special, it did have a special achievement. If you completed the raid without having a single death during all 3 of the fights in one single clear, you would get a unique color of the raid's gear set. A quite unique reward that was removed with the BFA pre-patch. January 18th, 2017, the Nighthold, still part of Tier 1. This raid took a fair while to clear for once, 11 days and a massive 248 attempts for Gul'dan to finally drop on the 4th of February. Illidan was free, and with that, a couple of mounts too. For the meta achievement, the Grove Defiler, and for random drops, the Fellblaze and the Hellfire Infernals. Both dropped from Gul'dan, but the Fellblaze Infernal dropped from any difficulty of Gul'dan, except for the first week of the boss fight being on Raid Finder where the Infernal could drop as a bug. But the Hellfire Infernal acted as a 100% mount from Gul'dan from killing him on Mythic, again being reduced to 1% come the BFA pre-patch. With how powerful players got by the end of Legion, and how long they had to farm this mount, it ended up with the green version available in all difficulties being more rare than the red one, as at least the red was a guaranteed drop, while the green seemingly had less than a 1% chance to drop. Our next raid was the Tomb of Sargeras, releasing June 20th. The final boss being yet again another demon lord we beat before, Kil'jaeden. This fight was well known for how horrible it was. 654 wipes to take down. It required most of the raid to race change to goblins in order to use rocket jump to counter one of the boss's mechanics, and also with a heavy RNG in the fight, it took quite the toll on players. Fun fact, he died 2 years exactly after Archimonde did on July 16th, 2017. The raid's meta achievement did not give a special mount, it only gave a title and pet. Rather lame for non-pet battlers, but at least it had the Abyssal Worm mount which dropped from Mistress Sazine. And the final raid of Legion was Antor's the Burning Throne, released November 28th, 2017. The final boss, Argus the Unmaker, would survive a whole 8 days, dying on December 13th. This raid also contained a special legendary. There were epic trinkets that players could obtain, being based on the Titans. However, Argus himself had a chance to drop a legendary trinket. This trinket having an extremely rare chance to drop. Some guilds killing Argus multiple times every week they would never see this trinket with just how rare it was. Quite odd, but it was quite powerful. At least for some specs, that is. Mount-wise, there was 4 of them. The Antoran Gloomhound earned from the meta achievement, and its twin brother, both based on the Twin Hounds boss of the raid, the Antoran Charhound, which was a rare drop from those specific bosses. Sadly, putting these mounts side by side does not make them bigger like the bosses do when they're near each other. And once again, we were given a mythic-only final boss mount, that being the Shackled Urzul. An amazing mount at that. Sick and twisted, it was a 100% chance to drop when killed on Mythic. But with the BFA pre-patch, it was dropped to 1%. And for the Ahead of the Curve achievement, we had the Violet Spellwing. This mount was gained by gathering a Blood of the Titan from Heroic or higher Argus the Unmaker, and then turning it into Khadgar. Like other Ahead of the Curve achievement mounts, it was made unavailable come the pre-patch for the next expansion. Now to BFA, the last complete expansion at the time of this video, releasing August 14th, 2018. Its first raid Uldir would release September 11th, 2018, with its final boss Gahun dropping dead on the 19th of September, only living 8 days. While no mounts dropped in the raid, completing its meta achievement gave the players the Glory of the Uldir Raider and the Bloodgorge Crag. Next, we have the Battle for Dazara Lore, one of the most unique raids in many years. First off, it had different bosses based on your faction. While Trial of the Grand Crusader had different bosses based on factions visually, and so did Icecrown Citadel with the loot ship being the opposite faction, this one had 3 different bosses with not only different bosses visually, but also different boss rooms, and even slightly different mechanics in some cases. It also had the unique effect of transforming your race. While Caverns of Time dungeons in the past have visually changed your race, this was the first time your race actually got changed, force changing your racials. The Champion of Light, Grog, and Jadefire Masters fights were all different between Horde and Alliance. The Jadefire Masters, for example's trash, and the fight itself being famously much easier for Alliance than Horde. Then comes the fight Opulence, Conclave of the Chosen, the King Rusticon. Horde members would be transformed into Alliance and replay the Alliance attack, while the Alliance would be transformed into the Horde to replay the Horde retaliation during the High Tinker Mechatorque, Stormwind Blockade, and the Lady Jaina Proudmoore fights. This was super unique and overall an amazing storytelling aspect, something I would love to see used more often in the future. Maybe even with Lady Sylvanas' fight being slightly different for Horde members who chose to support her in BFA? Now on to dates and times. The raid released January 29th, 2019, and Jaina finally died after 346 wipes 7 days later, on February 5th. Completing the meta achievement gave the Dazara Lore Wind Reaver, but the raid itself has amazing mounts as drops. First, the Gmod, a replica of Galliwix's blinged out mech suit, including a massive engravement on its face and its shield, dropping from High Tinker Mechatorque. The next mount is the Glacial Tidestorm, a water/ice elemental drop from Jaina on Mythic. It was guaranteed when it was current, but now it's only a 1% drop. Which, by the way, later in BFA's lifespan, Blizzard made a hotfix, which caused this and the rest of the BFA final bosses' mythic mounts to drop 2 at a time instead of 1, doubling the amount raids could get each week. The Crucible of Storm, our first 2-boss raid in a long time, and also a very hard one at that. Releasing April 23rd, it took until May 3rd to get beat. With over 700 pulls, it took 9 days to go down. Who would have thought that a raid with only 2 bosses would be so hard? Although to be fair, the reason the wipe count was so high was because of a Phase 1 mechanic that could wipe the raid very quickly if the 6 people it went on touched each other. And since the super deadly mechanic was an early Phase 1 mechanic, it racked up an inflated amount of wipes for all World First Raiders until it was hotfixed. Next, we have the Eternal Palace. Releasing July 16th, it took 12 days for Azshara to be defeated, ending on July 28th. This raid overall was seen poorly by the community, with a few rather annoying fights, like the ones with Orgoza having a maze, Radiance of Azshara being an annoying mess of tornadoes, and Blackwater Behemoth, which, ironically, was one of the rather well-liked fights and was completely underwater. And then Queen Azshara herself, the first boss in many years to require the player to actively use line-of-sight mechanics for most of the mechanics for the fight, and that did not go over well for players, especially healers trying to heal people on the other side of pillars. The raid had the Azshari Bloat Ray from its meta achievement, but didn't have any random drop mounts. Last to BFA, Ny'alotha the Waking City, its meta achievement granting the Wriggling Parasite mount, the final boss N'Zoth dropping the Ny'alotha All-Seer on Mythic only. Again guaranteed to drop 1, later 2 on kill, but reduced to 1% drop rate with the pre-patch. And the Ahead of the Curve mount, the spawn of Vexinoa, given to players who killed N'Zoth on Heroic before the launch of the Shadowlands pre-patch. Now, how did the raid go? Well, overall, the raid was good, but the new corruption system introduced kind of ruined how a lot of people felt about the place. And especially with an old god going down so easily, it angered a lot of the player base. Although, it seems a lot of people forget that shooting anything with a beam intended to glass an entire planet, made to destroy old gods in case they infected the planet, is likely to kill it, no matter if it's a powerful old god or not. So, with the raid releasing January 28th, 2020, N'Zoth the Corruptor, the final old god of Azeroth, would find himself vaporized Kamehameha style after only 10 days, February 6, 2020. Cool fact, this was the first ever world first end boss killed by US in over 8 years. As for the last 8 years before this, EU had a much better time. Maybe in part to complexity limit running a 21-man raid roster. Maybe go look up the video on that, but gist of it is instead of having the raid lead in the raid, they are focused 100% on raid leading by watching the raid through their streams, so they can focus on what needs to be done by who without worrying about doing their own stuff and doing a rotation. Another fun fact, this is the first raid ever that has required players to have their legendary to beat it, as engaging N'Zoth without the legendary cape would have the player near instantly mind-controlled, turning them against their allies. Which was an interesting experience when N'Zoth finally opened up for LFR raiders. Now onto the current expansion, Shadowlands. Castle Nathria is the first raid of the expansion. The raid only had 1 mount, the Rampart Screecher, from completing the meta achievement. The expansion released on October 26, 2020, and the raid released in December 8, 2020. The final boss, Sire Denathrius, was finally killed on December 23rd. It took a fair while. For a first raid of an expansion, Castle Nathria proved itself to actually be quite hard. Well worth the Vampire Lord himself, though. Now, for the final raid launched at the time of this video, the Sanctum of Domination, which is not out yet. However, it will be launching on July 6th, with the Mythic launch the next week on July 13th. So obviously, as the raid has not come out yet, we can't really talk about what was killed first or how long it took. So for now, we all just have to wait and see how long all that takes. But what we can talk about is the mounts. With 3 mounts, the raid is rather well off. The Sanctum Gloomcharger dropping from the 9, and Vengeance, a Maw-themed Dragonhawk, a manifestation of Sylvanas' want and need for vengeance, acting as the 100% mythic drop mount from Sylvanas Windrunner. Like all others, going to be reduced to 1% come the next expansion after Shadowlands. The final mount being the Hand of Hrestmurok, a giant hand mount granted to players who complete the meta achievement for the raid. But it's been quite a while since we've had a legendary weapon drop from a raid, and who better to drop one than Sylvanas herself, with her rare Shalair's Death Whisper, our first legendary weapon in 10 years. Hunters using this bow gain a new ability, allowing them to fire a wailing arrows that damages and silences in an AoE, just like her ability in Heroes of the Storm, while also having a back that hunters can equip with the appearance of a quiver, giving them a Withering Arrow passive, again like her Heroes of the Storm ability. And while we're at it, we might as well mention the Edge of Night Dagger, which works for rogues, applying a debuff that deals damage and finishing moves deal more damage as the enemy's health gets lower. Also, as the years went on, we got time walking in Warlords of Draenor, allowing players to replay old dungeons, scale down to somewhat relevant power levels for their respective place. However, as expansions went on, we got more and more expansions, eventually even getting time walking raids, allowing us to replay old raids as they were currently. Sort of, being Black Temple, Old War, and Firelands. Black Temple time walking allowing players to earn the Warglave's transmog for the Demon Hunters, even eventually introducing a limited time event for the 15th year anniversary, having raid groups do small fractions of key moments in raids of the past. Lady Vosh, Kel'Thas, and Archimonde for TBC, Hagen, Anubarak, and Arthas for Wrath of the Lich King, Cho'Gall, Nefarian, and Ragnaros for Cataclysm. Upon completing all of these iconic bosses of the past, the players would be given the Memories of Fell Frost and Fire achievement, granting them the Obsidian Worldbreaker mount, a mount with a huge resemblance to Deathwing, an amazing celebration of 15 years of WoW. And of course, with Classic having been introduced, many of the raid times were just destroyed. Karazhan, Magtheridon's Lair, Gruul's Lair all having been cleared within 48 hours of launch. Classic really has shown how much player base of WoW has grown, and how much we have metagamed everything to the utmost of optimization. So I would love to go over that, but it's rather depressing how quickly some of these impossibly difficult, going to take forever to clear raids were actually cleared in Classic, with I think even one of them being cleared after an hour after it launched. Now, as mentioned above, this video would be way too long if we went in depth over everything. So we didn't mention skips, which, for example, raids are very long, and so many of them had unlockable skips. Killing specific bosses on a difficulty would eventually allow you to skip right to the boss in future weeks. In places like Castle Nathria, Hellfire Citadel, and Blackrock Foundry, this made re-clearing the raid no longer necessary when you only wanted the final couple bosses. In this video, we'll be going over the history of some of the rare mounts in vanilla WoW. Mounts that people knew about, but were very difficult to obtain for one reason or another. First up, we have the Winter Spring Frost Saber. This was a mount only available to Alliance players, and simply required you to grind out the reputation known as the Winter Saber Trainers. There were only 2 NPCs in the game associated to this rep, and only one of them would actually talk to you or did anything. So in Winter Spring, you could talk to an NPC known as River Frostwind, who would give you a quest to go kill some bears and chimera in the nearby area, and after you completed it, you would get around 50 rep. And then the quest would turn to be repeatable, so you could do it over and over again to get more reputation. After a bit of rep, you unlocked another quest which would ask you to kill some Furbolg, that would then also become repeatable after you completed it, giving another avenue for 50 more rep per completion. And then once you had honored, you'd unlock the last repeatable quest, the Rampaging Giants, which had you go out and kill around 8 elite giants in the area, for a total of 75 rep, which generally wasn't worth it compared to the other 2 quests, and because the only way to get rep was through these 3 repeatable quests, they would take the average non-human 840 quest completions before you got exalted, or 746 if you included the giant quests as well. And we're talking about vanilla WoW quests with low drop chances and spawn rates, and of course actually hard elite mobs, so doing 840 of these was kind of insane. And at the end of it, you would simply unlock the vendor which would allow you to purchase the Frost Saber for 100 gold. But at least it was an epic mount that could be used with basic training, so it could save you some gold on a mount if you didn't want to unlock epic training. The only reason this mount was rare was because it was hard to obtain, and because it was Alliance only. In the Burning Crusade, when Blood Elves were added to the game, they weren't initially hostile to this NPC, and could talk to it in order to get neutral reputation, although they still couldn't accept or do any of the quests for them, so that never went anywhere beyond that. And eventually this little bug was fixed and they had the reputation removed. They also greatly increased the amount of reputation you gained from this in the Burning Crusade by a magnitude of 5 times, so you only had to complete a measly 168 quests in order to get exalted, which is still a lot. In Cataclysm, they removed the old method for how to obtain this mount, and instead added a much more simple daily quest system, where you do a series of 20 dailies in order to get it instead. And then they finally added a Horde equivalent in Wrath of the Lich King, which was an Ungoro Crater and awarded a Raptor instead. And if you complete either of these quests in Retail WoW, you'll be given the other one on the opposite faction, so you don't need to unlock both of them. Next up, we have the Unarmored Class Epic Mounts. Before patch 1.4, every race except the Undead who had the option to buy the 100% speed epic mounts only had the option to buy different colored versions of their normal 60% speed mounts. And since patch 1.4 was only 5 months into the launch of the game, there were not a lot of people who were able to actually obtain the epic mounts yet. Because you see, in early vanilla, mounts didn't really have training, and instead were just items that had level requirements on them. So if you had a mount, you could just use it. And in order to purchase the epic mounts, they cost 1,000 gold, which is equivalent to around 500,000 gold in retail's currency. So being able to farm that out within the first 5 months was not something a lot of people did. In fact, most people didn't even make it to max level within that time, let alone also farm out the equivalent to 500,000 gold. So the amount of people who actually owned one of the unarmored versions was very small. Made even smaller by the fact that when they did introduce the armored versions of the mount to the game, they added the option to trade in the old ones for the new ones. So a lot of people traded in their very rare color variations for the new, better looking armored ones, without knowing they were trading away future rare mounts. The only races it didn't really apply to were the undead, because they were already given armored versions of their epic mounts from the beginning for some reason. And that's probably why they decided to slap armor on the rest of the mounts as well, to kind of copy the undead. And now we'll go into the raid drop mounts. First up, we have the ZG mounts, the Swift Razashi Raptor and the Swift Zulian Tiger. Both of these mounts had about a 1% drop chance from ZG, which was a 20-man raid. The only thing rare about these mounts was the drop chance. Generally, in the modern game, mounts that drop from bosses and raids usually have about a 100% drop chance until it becomes old content. But back in Vanilla WoW, this wasn't really the case. In fact, this doesn't change until around after Cataclysm, really, and mounts were very rare and few and far in between. So there was already a 1 in 100 chance of getting them from a kill on a boss associated to the two mounts, but you also had to win a roll against 20 other people who probably never seen them drop either. Assuming the raid leader didn't just ninja loot the mount, or you weren't in a raid where the officers had the mounts in reserve for themselves. So you just had to be really lucky in order to obtain these mounts. And they were made even rarer once they removed them from the game in Cataclysm, when they revamped that raid zone as a dungeon. And for the other drop chance mounts, we have the Death Charger's Reigns from Shatrath, which had an even lower drop chance than the ZG mounts, with most people speculating it had around a 0.2% drop chance, which was later buffed in Wrath of the Lich King to a 1% drop chance. In order to get the mount, all you did was go into the dungeon Shatrath, and just kill the boss, Lord Arius Rivendare, and get very lucky by winning a roll against 5 to 10 other people, since dungeons weren't capped at 5 people back then. Probably a big reason for this mount's much lower drop chance was because it dropped from a dungeon rather than a raid, and it's much easier to farm a dungeon over and over than it is a raid for the simple facts that dungeons require less people to complete, and could be completed multiple times a day instead of once a week. So it kind of made sense in that regard. The mount itself was just a different color of the Forsaken Epic racial mount, so it was one of the few ways for Alliance players to ride around on the skeletal horse. And for a time, this mount was even one of the rarest items in the game, period. Next, we'll talk about the legendary mount, the Black Karaji Battle Tank. This mount was only obtainable for about 10 hours after the launch of the AQ40 event, which required a person to complete one of the longest quest chains in the game's history. That was also one of the hardest quest chains to complete in the game's history. And then ring the gong after the whole server came together and donate enough materials to start the event. Since the quest chain was so difficult to complete and basically required an entire guild funneling all their resources into one player, the amount of people who were able to actually complete the quest before the very limited 10-hour duration was very small, which is why even to this day, the Black Karaji Battle Tank is still one of the rarest mounts in the game's history. There are other colors of this mount that will drop that are much easier to get inside of the AQ40 raid. So it is actually pretty easy to get a Karaji mount. The only advantage the Black Battle Tank had over the others was being usable outside of the instance, which actually kind of made the ability a little bit buggy. No pun intended. You see, the mount allowed you to start casting it while you were still in combat, but wouldn't actually mount you up if you were still in combat by the time it finished casting, which didn't really give you much of an advantage, but was a distinction that wasn't shared by any other mounts until that was fixed. There was also a really minor bug in patch 2.2, where if a character logged out while they were on the mount when that patch went live, they would log in to find their character transformed into a flying wasp. This was only a one-time occurrence though, as the buff wasn't available by any other means and simply went away if you clicked it off or mounted up again. This might have been an intentional internal thing, as on the PTR for Wrath of the Lich King's launch, the Black Karaji Battle Tank had a tooltip change which roughly said that the mount would change depending on your riding skill and location. And if tested in locations that allowed you to fly, the mount would turn into a wasp and allow you to fly in that way, although this functionality was removed before the patch released. And currently, the mount is still a ground mount which can't actually fly, and also it was possible for people to obtain the mount in Wrath of the Lich King. When Blizzard opened up a couple of new servers, these fresh servers never had their gates opened in AQ40, so players would rush to complete the quest as quickly as possible in order to obtain this incredibly rare mount. And now, we'll talk about possibly one of the rarest mounts in the game's history, but, actually, which is probably not in the game anymore, and that's the fluorescent green Mechanostrider. This was an alt color of the Mechanostrider mount that gnomes received, which wasn't available to players in the game, but was a model in the game's files. One day, a player had a problem with his mount and messaged the GM about it, who sent him a replacement and accidentally sent him this alt color version, which wasn't supposed to be available to players. The player was allowed to keep the mount though, and was the only person in the game who had it, and you can't really beat a rare mount that only one person total has. Way later on down the road, the mount was removed from the character's collection sheet, like more than 10 years after, but we don't actually know the exact reason why. There's lots of speculations and rumors online though, that the person who owned the account tried to sell it during Warlords of Draenor on a WoW cheating site, and the tagline that he had was having the rarest mount in the game on his account, so Blizzard removed it from his collection. Now, I have no confirmation for this, I have looked into it pretty extensively, and it seems to be exclusively a rumor with no evidence other than other people and websites talking about the same rumors. But it's a very popular one. Whatever the case, it seems like the player who owned the mount no longer plays the game, so you'll probably never see it in-game unless they add the mount to the game later on in some other fashion. Next up, we have the Riding Turtle. This was a TCG loot card added to the game during Vanilla WoW, even though most of the other more famous TCG loot mounts were added during the Burning Crusade. And what the Riding Turtle did was simply allow you to mount up on a mount that didn't actually increase your running speed. In fact, it was slower on most occasions, since it used mount speed modifiers to move. So if you had any way to increase your speed while running, it wouldn't work on the mount. Although if you had a way to increase your mount speed, they would work on it. Since it was one of the earliest, if not the first, TCG loot card mount added to the game, when you typed in the code for the loot card to get the mount, you would only get on that one character on one server. So you wouldn't get on all of your characters until they added account-wide mounts in Mists of Pandaria. The turtle didn't actually increase your swim speed until Wrath of the Lich King, when they added the aquatic mount system to the game, with the sea turtle being an obtainable mount. Although they didn't really increase your swim speed as much as they do today, as they didn't get a buff to the swim speed until Legion. But at least it was slightly more useful than just a mount that didn't actually increase your movement or swim speed at all, and was purely a vanity item that you could ride around in town for looks. Especially with how rare it was because it sold out so quickly, and you could only have it on a single character. The mount was also a white item when it was first introduced to the game, so if you accidentally deleted the item, it wouldn't give you a confirmation if you wanted to delete it or not, since the protection only applied to blue or higher items, until the Burning Crusade when the item was properly changed to an epic quality item. Now let's talk about the Reigns of the Bengal Tiger. This was a very popular mount rumor that was never actually added to the game, but did appear in the alpha and was already coded and good to go in the game files. The Bengal Tiger mount rumor basically stated that you could get the mount in the actual game by doing some wall hopping in Stranglethorn Vale to get to the hidden cave, where a female vendor would sell you the mount. Many people did the wall jumping required to get to this cave, but it was always empty. There was speculation that the vendor was on a 1-month respawn timer, or that only one person per realm could buy from it, but no one ever saw her because she never existed. What made the rumors more credible was there was actual in-game screenshots of the mount. According to some comment threads online, the mount was given to all players in one of the early alpha or beta builds so they could get around quicker, which is where most of the screenshots of the mount in game came from, and then later on they all came from private servers. But just like the famous Ashbringer rumors, the in-game rumors never went anywhere. But exactly like the Ashbringer rumors, Blizzard did put a nod to the rumors in-game eventually. With a revamp of the old zones, Blizzard added a quest to the game that actually sends you to this cave, and then you get a cat pet as a reward. Not exactly a mount, but close enough. Another thing to note about the Bengal Tiger mount, if you look at which races can use it, it includes all of the vanilla races except the Taurens. This really shows you how early on in the alpha the mount was scrapped, since back then, Taurens were going to be given an ability to run as fast as mounts rather than giving any actual mounts to ride. But Blizzard eventually decided to scrap that idea and gave Taurens the ability to ride mounts. but not before they scrapped the Bengal tiger mount, apparently.
I recall an email that we got from Chris Metzen. Chris was incensed about something he had seen in some promotional materials where one of the designers had put a night elf on an orange tiger mount. Chris lost it. He was like, night elves should be on dark tigers only, black tigers, purple tigers, but never, ever, ever should a night elf be found on an orange tiger. So Rob emailed us all and reminded us that night elves could only be riding on approved tiger palette mounts.
In this video, we'll be going over a lot of retcons from WoW's history. Of course, retcon being Blizzard changing the lore of pre-established events, retroactively making new information canon. And since World of Warcraft has so many minor retcons, I'm obviously not going to be able to cover all of them. But I will go over pretty much all the major ones throughout the history of the game. Starting up with vanilla WoW and the many retcons, changes, recontextualizations, and just expanding things that were only mentioned briefly. In Warcraft 3, Thrall banned all warlocks from the Horde, but in vanilla WoW they changed their mind, and now the warlocks are kind of like the demon hunters, where they're okay with them using their powers as long as they use those dark powers against their masters. In Warcraft 2, the ability to control magic from the elements and the Twisty Nether were both part of shamanism, and Gul'dan separated himself from being especially talented at channeling the cold and negative energies of the Twisty Nether. This is why a lot of early orcs in lore, who were clearly warlocks, still retain their title of shaman. And Ner'zhul and Gul'dan, two of the most prolific warlocks in lore, were considered shamans beforehand, because there wasn't really a difference between them in the first place. This was later retconned to have a more clear difference between them, and shamans control a very specific subset of elements, and have nothing to do with fel magic or the Twisty Nether. Speaking of the Twisty Nether, originally, the Twisty Nether was basically hell, and warlocks would get their hellfire from the Twisty Nether, and all mentions of hell were also mentions of the Twisty Nether. Basically, the hell and Twisty Nether were synonymous with each other. That's why there are warlock abilities like hellfire, and a lot of characters have hell in their name, like the famous Hell Screams, since orcs were tied pretty heavily to the Twisty Nether early on. Although it's not just the Twisty Nether that got changed, there's also the existence of the Holy Light. Originally, it was just references to real-world religions, namely Christianity. Eventually, they kind of recontextualized it to make it more about a philosophy, where the Holy Light helps anyone who strongly believes in a cause. Although, this cause doesn't always have to be good, as seen by the fact that the Scarlet Crusade are very prolific light users. Now let's head over to the Burning Crusade expansion, where we have one of the most controversial retcons in WoW's history, and that is the origin of the Draenor. Originally, the Draenor were just used to refer to Akama and his race, and some of the lost ones that appeared in the Swamp of Sorrows, and the Eredar was a different race of demons that actually corrupted Sargeras. So the change was that the Draenor were actually the Eredar, who split off from the other ones when they originally joined the Legion and corrupted Sargeras, and then ran away to Draenor, where a subset of those ones became the Broken Ones. So the Draenor we knew in Warcraft 3 were just the corrupted Broken Ones, and the playable race ones were the original Draenor. The reason this caused a lot of controversy was because it was one of the first major retcons to the story, and tied one of the playable races to one of the most evil races at the time, the same people who ran the armies of the Burning Legion. It was so bad that Chris Metzen, the guy responsible for most of WoW's lore, wrote an apology post explaining why the retcon needed to be done, which is not something that happens very frequently. Outside of the major retcon that was the Draenor, there are a couple of other minor ones that happened in TBC. Originally, it was stated that all the Blood Elves followed Kael'thas to Outlands, but it was later changed that some stayed behind, and they were the ones who were worried about what happened to Kael'thas and joined the Horde to help them go out and find him in the Outlands. They also made Illidan, Kael'thas, and Lady Vash a lot more evil than they were in Warcraft 3. Although this was recontextualized later on, which I'll talk about when we get to that point in history. And finally, one minor retcon of a character. There's a character known as Mogor the Ogre, who was introduced in Warcraft 2, and was an incredibly intelligent two-headed ogre clan leader, which is unique by the fact that he has a singular personality instead of one split between the two heads, and was responsible for some pretty smart decisions on his part in order to keep him and his people alive. In the Burning Crusade, he was turned into a bloodthirsty idiot running a fighting ring, which is just a straight-up complete retcon of his character. Although, seeing as he was a minor character, no one really noticed. and players might recognize him more as the character who appears on the Ogre Magi card in Hearthstone, which is part of the base set. And he was given another card which actually has his name on it, and of course they both reference his stupid TBC version rather than his smarter Warcraft 2 version. In Wrath of the Lich King, there weren't any major retcons, other than them changing their mind about what happened with Ner'zhul inside the Helm of Domination, which really gets changed again later on, so it's not important to mention here. There's also some lore given on how the Frostmourne was made, which again is changed again later on, but basically it was an artifact of the Burning Legion in control of the Dreadlords, and it wasn't really meant to be that powerful compared to other artifacts, and was made a lot stronger thanks to Ner'zhul's influence on it. They also changed the importance of the Helm of Domination. Previously, the Lich King's armor was basically just used in order to trap Ner'zhul's soul, and it was the Frostmourne which was the big powerhouse of the whole Lich King getup. At the end of the expansion, after the Frostmourne is shattered, they mention that the Helm of Domination is needed in order to keep the undead in check, which wasn't really established in lore previously, but makes sense in retrospect. No one really disliked the Helm of Domination getting more importance. There's also some indications that Yogg-Saron probably influenced a couple of major events in WoW's history, although it doesn't really count as a retcon, and more of adding extra context to a situation that doesn't ultimately change anything. Same could be said about the Helm of Domination changes as well. In the Cataclysm, we get a lot more lore on the dragon aspects, seeing as the main boss is the corrupted dragon aspect being controlled by an old god. In the War of the Ancients novels, Crossus mentions the power level of the dragon aspects, and greatly exaggerates how strong they are, stating that all of the dragon aspects putting their power together, they could easily defeat the old gods. In Cataclysm, we get a more realistic viewpoint on their power. They are strong, but not old god strong. Although, they were basically created in order to stop the Hour of Twilight, which was the prophecy of the old gods breaking free from their prisons and taking control. So, they were kind of used to stop the old gods, just not in the way they were described previously. In Mists of Pandaria, we got a whole bunch of new lore. It's probably one of the most significant lore expansions we've ever gotten, as it added a whole bunch of context to old lore that happened alongside everything else. And they had to find a way to explain why it hadn't really showed up before, and they did an excellent job of explaining it. The island was cut off from the rest of the world for thousands of years. One of the Titan Keepers took up resident there and built some powerful stuff. There's a race of Titan-created constructs that took over, as well as a couple of races created by one of the dead old gods. Really, the only major retcon we got from pre-established lore was that Chen Stormstout was no longer from Pandaria itself, and instead was from the Wandering Isle, which makes a lot more sense seeing as Pandaria was cut off from the rest of the world. In Warlords of Draenor, they retconned the skin color of Blackrock orcs. Originally, they had a different skin color from the years of living inside Blackrock Mountain without sunlight. But the Blackrock orcs shown on alternate Draenor already seem to have that skin color despite not living on Azeroth yet. And besides this one minor retcon, WoD is also when the first Chronicle book came out, right before Legion, which has probably the most amount of retcons than anything. In Warcraft 2, it was established that the spirits of the dead go to the Twisty Nether. Now, there's a proper afterlife for different types of creatures. The Guardian Aegwynn had parts of her personality retcon. Originally, she was kind of arrogant, so when she was given the powers of the Guardian by the Council of Tearsfall, she kept them for herself and prolonged her life so she didn't have to hand them over to a new Guardian someday. Then she tricked a mage named Aran into becoming the father of her son Medivh, which he wanted to be the new Guardian. The retcon basically states that she was just a confident girl who did actually know better than everyone else and wasn't super arrogant like her previous self, and that she no longer tricked the father of Medivh into having a child, and that she actually kind of fell in love with Aran and wanted to have a kid together, rather than just wanting to have a proper father for her son, and not actually caring who the father was. And besides a lot of more minor stuff, there were 3 big retcons that were introduced with the Chronicles, namely the Old Gods, the Legion, and the Titans themselves. In the War of the Ancients books, Crossus states that the Old Gods, if they teamed up together, would be able to make even Sargeras plead for the peace of death. And of course, goes on to say that the aspects are the most powerful creatures of all mortal planes, and they're the only force capable of defeating the Old Gods. Obviously, none of that was true come the Cataclysm, and we got a more realistic sense of the power of the Old Gods. The Old Gods were given a proper origin. Basically, they're parasites sent throughout the universe in order to corrupt world souls and planets, and the reason they thrive on Azeroth is because the planet itself also happens to be a Titan, which isn't really a retcon, just new information. And it introduces a boss for the old gods known as the Warlords. So now we know for sure that the old gods are alien creatures, and that there are others out there in the universe. And they're not stronger than the Titans, but their bosses are probably stronger than the Titans. Now let's go over the Titans. Originally, they were described as a metallic race, with the leaders of their society being the Pantheon, filled with the Titans that we know of today. This was changed to just only be the Pantheon, and they're the only Titans that exist. And also, they are a lot stronger than they were originally described. Although, to be fair, they were originally described as bringing order to millions of other planets, so it's more of a downsizing of the amount of manpower that went into it, where they still keep their accomplishments. They were just done by a lot fewer people. And because they changed the amount of Titans, the individual Titans themselves grew much stronger, and are currently some of the strongest things known in the Warcraft universe. As Sargeras, stated as the strongest of the Titans, was able to kill a whole planet full of old gods by himself by just cutting it in half. And another Titan was able to kill the strongest old god of Azeroth by just plucking it out like a tick. They were also changed to be all dead by the time Warcraft starts, with the only living Titan being Sargeras, who controls the Burning Legion. As previously, we were led to believe the Titans were still alive out there, as Algalon the Observer even said he was going to send a message directly to the Titans before he was stopped. And they even added a piece of lore to Raden, stating the reason he became depressed and was defeated by the Mogu was because he found out the Titans had died. Although in Legion, we find out the Titans were killed by Sargeras, but he was able to capture their souls and use them as fuel. Well, all but one of them anyway. And the Titans being dead the whole time was kind of a big reveal, although the fact that they came back almost immediately afterwards does a good job of letting them stay in the lore. And finally, the Legion themselves. This was another huge retcon. Originally, Sargeras was just a demon lord. Then he was changed as someone who was corrupted by the Eridar. And finally in Chronicles, they changed it again to finding some dreadlords who told him about the Void. And the Void scared him so much, he went about the universe trying to destroy everything, so that he could snuff out any inkling of a Void world being born into the universe, as he knew eventually life would come back afterwards and he could properly watch over it, so that no Void Lords could be born like the planet he cut in half. So it could be said they changed the origin of his corruption to the Dreadlords rather than the Eridar, and instead he just went to the Eridar afterwards and wanted them to lead his armies, because it requires a lot of generals in order to run an army as big as the Burning Legion. They still let Sargeras be the one who killed the rest of the Pantheon though, although after the Pantheon had visited Azeroth and contained the old god corruption there. So Sargeras is still a villain, but I think this retcon gives him better motivations personally, and basically accomplishes the same thing with the Legion as before, where originally he wanted to destroy everything because he thought it was the natural order of the universe to destroy rather than to make things orderly. Although that's not it with the retcons. Before Legion came out, we also got the Illidan novel, which goes into detail and explains what happened in the Burning Crusade with Illidan and Kel'Thas and Akama. Basically, everything that happened in the Burning Crusade still happened, with a few minor things that didn't really retcon very much. Illidan was still a huge jerk to everyone, enslaved a whole bunch of people, used souls in order to power his machines and portals, summoned the demons, enslaved Akama, but he was doing all this because he was planning an attack on the Burning Legion. He knew how powerful the Burning Legion was, and how impossible it was to stop them, although he was fanatically devoted to finding out a way to do it anyway. And he actually had a lot of really good ideas. He was even helped out by the Naru Zera when he was almost caught on Argus trying to spy on Kil'jaeden, when he was trying to establish a link to the Legion homeworld. And part of the reason all of the events in the Burning Crusade happened was because Illidan just did not trust anyone but his demon hunters with his plans. He thought everyone was a spy reporting back to Kil'jaeden, and in order for his plan to work, needed basically a surprise attack, since he knew he could never win in a frontal assault against the infinite army of the Burning Legion. And eventually, his paranoia is what caused some of his allies to turn against him, and it was what allowed Kil'jaeden to actually convert Kel'Thas over to his side. Kel'Thas originally went evil for almost no reason, almost like they needed a villain in the Burning Crusade and just kind of ignored his character from Warcraft 3. In the Illidan novel and in Chronicles, we get a lot more context to this. Kel'Thas desperately wanted a way to control his people's mana addiction after the destruction of the Sunwell. Illidan had promised him a way to control his people's addiction, and to an extent, what he offered was working. He taught them how to siphon energy from other creatures and to even store it in mana boxes for later use. Although Kael'thas knew about the demon hunters and how he was training them with fel magic, which was like 10 times more powerful than the tiny methods Illidan was teaching them, and directly asked him in order to teach him and his blood elves how to use fel magic as well. Although Illidan just told him no, and would not discuss it further. And this made Kael'thas very suspicious of Illidan, on why he wouldn't trust him with the use of magic. And Kil'jaeden was able to exploit this weakness with him, and agreed to teach him how to use fel magic, and that Illidan was secretly plotting against them. That's why he wouldn't tell them how to use this powerful magic. And Kael'thas, even though he was a mana addict at this time, actually refused Kil'jaeden at first, before a few more events happened, like a portion of his army defected in Shattrath when they were trying to subjugate the city, and Illidan not doing anything about it when he told them, which eventually led Kael'thas to taking the deal with Kil'jaeden begrudgingly and learning how to use fel magic, and he just absolutely fell in love with it. The main reason Illidan never taught anyone else fel magic was because it killed half the people he was teaching. And Akama just really wanted his temple back and was incredibly short-sighted about it. Illidan did actually tell him that he needed it in order to fight against the Burning Legion and that he would give it back to him after the job was done. Although, Akama thought he was just given excuses in order to keep it forever because he thought defeating the Burning Legion wasn't possible. And of course, Illidan didn't share any of his plans to Akama further than that, so Akama just convinced himself that Illidan was never going to give it back, and he had to go behind Illidan's back in order to try to get it for himself, where he made some deals with Maiev that eventually got him captured and his spirit enslaved. So the Illidan novel's retcons were more of recontextualizations of events that already happened, and don't actually change much. Other than the fact that the Burning Crusade, it said that Illidan did try to teach a couple of Blood Elves how to become demon hunters, and there's even a quest involved with you trying to kill one of them, which isn't really mentioned or brought up because it's kind of a minor change. If anything, the Illidan novel does the best job of adding a whole bunch of retcons, because all it does is give more context to events that already happened in order to change them in a way that fits with the new story they're trying to tell without invalidating everything that happened in the past. Illidan and Kael'thas were still arrogant, but at least they had better reasons than just becoming evil for no reason. And now we finally make it over to Legion, where there's a handful of retcons as well. Originally, the Broken Isles were supposed to have been submerged for 10,000 years, and they weren't raised until the Second War, where Gul'dan went out there to raise the Broken Isles. This was instead changed to Gul'dan only raising the Broken Shore, which left the rest of the Broken Isles to have always been up, which allows things like the existence of the High Mountain Tauren and Suramar to happen. Speaking of Suramar, in the War of the Ancients trilogy, Suramar is described as being completely destroyed by the Legion, and mainly only occupied by reanimated undead. In Legion, we're told that Suramar is fully intact, because 10,000 years ago they created a gigantic dome over it, which protected them and isolated them from the rest of the world at the time. Maiev was also made a very important character in Legion, which was done by softly retconning the events of the Wolfheart novel. In the book, Maiev orchestrated the murder of a whole bunch of elves that were trying to rejoin Night Elf society, who also wanted to keep using arcane magic, which was a big no-no at the time. Eventually, she was just stopped and ran away, after attempting to assassinate Malfurion, and her whereabouts were left to be dealt with at a later time. In Legion, you're introduced to Maiev, well, outside of Demon Hunter exclusive events, by rescuing her from prison, and her brother comes to her and they have one dialogue about the novel, and just kind of brush it aside because they both agree dealing with the Legion is more important. Because it was thanks to her brother's help that they were able to find out it was her doing all the murders in the book, and he was trying to hunt her down, which they just kind of brushed aside. They don't completely say that it didn't happen, they just heavily downplay it. That was until BFA anyway. In the events of the book Shadows Rising, Maiev is depicted amongst all of the other Night Elf leaders when Thrall comes to visit, alongside characters like Malfurion and Tyrande, which is a pretty heavy indication that they just completely ignored what happened in Wolfheart, and in fact do retcon whatever she did there. Gul'dan had his origins officially changed with Chronicles 2, which came out during Legion. Before, he was an apprentice of Ner'zhul, and then ended up joining the Burning Legion and betraying his master. Although Chronicles 2, as well as Gul'dan's Harbinger's video before Legion, state that he was actually from an unnamed clan that he destroyed, before later joining the Shadowwind clan and then becoming the apprentice of Ner'zhul, where he had already been part of the Legion before he ever met Ner'zhul, rather than learning about the Legion from stuff that Ner'zhul had done. In Chronicles 3, which also came out during Legion, we got a lot more retcons than what Volume 2 had, where Volume 3 unofficially retconned Medan out of the story, as they have a humorous little note at the end of the book in the index, where Medan is listed as being on page 404, which is usually the code for a page that's not found on the internet. Medan is a character from a comic book series that Blizzard produced, and generally, whenever Blizzard creates outside source material about lore, they try their best to add characters and events from those books into the game, to signify that they did actually happen in lore. And this does include their manga and comics. Although, much of Medan has always been missing, and we got some hints that they were going to not include him when the Legion rolled out, and Meryl Fellstorm was added to the game as a major character for the Mage Order Hall campaign, and his backstory completely left out any mention of Medan. This is significant because Meryl Fellstorm was basically Medan's surrogate father in the comic books, and his story is heavily tied to Medan's. They also gave a lot of accomplishments that Medan did in the comics to Garona, who was supposed to be his mother, and just kind of removed everything else he did as it was kind of ridiculous anyway and didn't really impact the plot that much. So, who is Medan anyway? Well, just think of Anduin, a young boy who wants peace and doesn't like violence, but imagine if Anduin had more powers than Superman, and there you go. Medan was half mage, half shaman, half druid, and half paladin, and also better than a full character of any of those classes. He was also crowned the new Guardian of Tirisfal, and empowered with the abilities of basically all the classes instead of just a bunch of arcane mages like previous ones. And of course, wielded the powerful legendary weapon known as Aitiesh, which was officially given to Khadgar instead later on. The only thing Medan couldn't use was Void and Fel Magic, but I don't think that really mattered since he could use everything else and it didn't really have any counter. Medan was never a super well-liked character, and if they ever needed a character like Medan in the game for something, they could just use Anduin instead because he's basically a non-Merisu version of Medan anyway. Chronicles 3 also gave Moria a lot of credit for a bunch of things that happened in Classic WoW. She was the one responsible for planting rumors about Ragnaros, which caught the attention of the Hydraxian Warlords, which eventually got Venturers sent into Molten Core to defeat Ragnaros for her, and cemented her place as the leader of the Dark Iron Dwarves, in addition to a few other things she did. Before, these are just kind of things that happened, and they just kind of retroactively gave Moria credit for all of it. Volume 3 also gives a lot of context behind Kel'Thas and Lady Vash's actions when they joined Illidan. I already explained Kel'Thas during the Illidan novel part, and we got a lot of those motivations from him outlined in Volume 3. So I kind of talked about them a little bit earlier in the video than when they actually appeared chronologically. For Lady Vash, originally, she said that she joined Illidan because she remembered his powers from the War of the Ancients and respected his demonic powers. Chronicles instead says that she specifically joined because the old gods told her to, and also did not respect his power or the past at all. Kind of a minor change in my opinion, but they did retroactively change her motivations, which kind of make more sense than randomly helping Illidan for no reason who had been in prison for 10,000 years. Overall, Chronicles 3 didn't have as many major retcons as the first volume, and then in BlizzCon later on, we were told that the Chronicles were told from one perspective. They may not be 100% correct, which is corporate speak for, we can retcon some of the retcons if we want to later. Now, let's head over to Battle for Azeroth, and we'll talk about everyone's most hated retcons, the motivations of Sylvanas. I will say, most of the things people think are retcons about Sylvanas' motivations are not, and mostly come down to people just not following her story post Wrath of the Lich King. But that doesn't mean there weren't retcons nonetheless. One of the biggest ones happens in the Before the Storm novel, which is a prequel book to BFA, where Sylvanas has an inner dialogue in the book where she states that she never wanted to be war chief, regretted the fact that Vol'jin had died at the Broken Shore, and preferred to rule things from the shadows. At the end of BFA and in parts of Shadowlands, they retconned her inner dialogues from the book, stating that it was always her plan to become war chief. It was the jailer and Mazala working together that got Vol'jin killed and made him make Sylvanas the new war chief, which allowed them to cause a whole bunch of destruction and funnel souls into the Maw in order to fuel whatever plan they have going on in the Shadowlands. And one other big retcon with BFA is the fact that the old gods are now dead. In the past, it used to be that all of the old gods we faced in raids were defeated, but we kind of just defeated in avatar versions of themselves and then pushed them back. BFA lore establishes that players did in fact kill those old gods, but then goes on to say they don't experience death the same way as mortals, so it still kind of leaves them up in the air. Basically, their story is done for now until Blizzard wants to use them again later. This also brings up an inconsistency with the fact that the old gods cannot be killed, otherwise it destroys the planet. So one can assume another retcon in the future in order to explain that. And finally, we head over to the Shadowlands. Immediately, one of the retcons is the fact that spirit healers are actually Kyrian Watchers and not the Valkyrie as stated in the Chronicle books. There was another Frostmorn and Helm of Domination retcon with the Shadowlands, seeing as they play a very important part of the expansion. Instead of the weapons being forged by the Nathrezim, i.e. the Dreadlords, they were created by the Rune Carver, and then whoever was controlling the Rune Carver just gave them to the Nathrezim, who then used them for other purposes. This isn't so much a retcon as a recontextualization of the origins of the two items, as before the origins weren't super important, and it doesn't matter if the Nathrezim specifically created them themselves, if the Rune Forger was just forced to make them for them. If anything, it makes more sense that the items were not created by the Nathrezim, considering how they retconned the helm again to make it even more powerful, since it was able to be used to break open a gigantic portal to the Shadowlands. There's also some retcons involving Uther. They changed what his last words to Arthas were, as well as changed the origin of the original soul, as during the Shadowbringers special, it shows that Uther was taken to Bastion, whereas in-game his spirit shows up at a couple of locations. This is pretty easily explained by just having different shards of his soul, which is a pre-established thing, and doesn't necessarily constitute a retcon. But it does bring up the fact of what happens to the shards of his souls afterwards. Do they go back to the original soul in Bastion and give them the memories of what they did and said, or do they just disappear forever? And finally, the retcon is Sylvanas going to hell. Originally, after the Lich King was defeated, Sylvanas killed herself, but was so spooked by what she saw in hell that she decided to find a way to help her Forsaken people not share the same fate she had. This was retconned that she went to the Maw instead, and it's presumably where she found the jailer and made her current pact, which still ultimately kind of accomplishes the same thing. Currently, they're in the middle of building the mystery of Sylvanas' story up and up, so we don't actually know how this situation will play out. So it could still play out with the same motivations, just done in a different way. Kind of like Illidan. Alright, and with that, we reach the current timeline of WoW, which as of making this video was the beginning of Shadowlands. World of Warcraft has a ton of retcons. I basically only covered the major ones, and a few minor ones that I personally liked, but there is a whole bunch more minor stuff. Legendaries have been one of the most sought after items in WoW, and for good reason too. They are by far the strongest items in the game. At least until they were replaced by leveling greens in the next expansion, that is. And so, of course, we have had many legendaries over the years of WoW, and many different methods of obtaining them, which we'll be going over today. In vanilla, there were 5 major legendaries, the first being a random drop for Molten Core, the Talisman of Binding Shard. This legendary was, and still is, the only necklace in the game to have a visual effect on the player model. And rightfully so, as the necklace was never intended to be obtained by players. It was accidentally left in the game and not noticed till a player obtained it. Blizzard then removed it from the game afterwards, but let the person who had it keep it. Although for many years it was visible in the player's armory, since he quit the game in Wrath of the Lich King and the updated armory, the item is gone, replaced with a generic PvP necklace. It is unsure if the player simply no longer has the item, or it's just simply no longer visible. The next legendary was Sulphurous, Hand of Ragnaros. This legendary was pretty simple really, crafted first as an epic rarity hammer. You then needed to kill Ragnaros for the chance that the Eye of Sulphurous legendary item would drop, and if it did, you can then use it to enchant the weapon, turning it into a legendary. And before we leave the Molten Core, we have one more legendary, Thunder Fury, Blessed Blade of the Windseeker. This legendary was attained from 2 bindings that were found in the raid, combined and then forged into a blade using expensive materials, to then be fully enchanted by summoning and then killing Therid the Windseeker. It's also probably one of the most well-known legendaries in the game and even made it over into Diablo 3. Next, we have the Black Karaji Resonating Crystal, the only legendary mount in the game. A mount we have a whole video on because of how long the process is to get the thing, probably the longest question in the game's history in fact. But the general gist of it was to travel all over the world, gathering all sorts of materials and helping out the Dragonflights. Eventually you'd get the legendary mount if you helped open the gates or rang the gong within 24 hours after the first one did. And lastly for vanilla we have Atiesh, Great Staff of the Guardian from Naxxramas, requiring you to gather fragments within the raid, and then go to old raids and dungeons to empower it into its legendary self, even having slightly different stats based on which class was crafting it. and with a small different colored ribbon to distinct them. Although its teleporting to Karazhan ability was very unique, it was not really that useful until the next expansion, when Karazhan would become a raid. Next, we move on into the Burning Crusade. During the fight with Kael'thas Sunstrider in the Eye of Eternity raid, you had to progress through many different phases of the fight to finally take him out, and after killing his team of bodyguards, you then had to kill their enchanted weapons, which once killed could be looted for a limited duration legendary item that you needed to finish the rest of the fight. A legendary bow, which also came with the only legendary arrows ever in the game, the only legendary shield ever in the game, a mace, a sword, a dagger, a staff, and a two-handed axe. These weapons needed to be distributed amongst specific raid members who would need to perform specific roles during the fight, using that weapon's skill's special abilities to prevent spells like mind controls. Although cool, these weapons disappeared upon death, or after 15 minutes of real time. And a fun fact, there was a little bug with the Kael'thas fight, where the bodyguards would keep gathering aggro even while they were dead, and a way tanks could counter this, so that they didn't just kill the healers immediately when they resurrected, was to equip the legendary staff and just spam use its ability since it didn't have an internal cooldown. This staff would generate a very minor amount of threat, and since you could use this staff as many times as you could fit it into a macro, you could basically use one bug in order to counter another. Next, we go to the Black Temple and Illidan himself, and the War Glaives of Azeroth. These glaives, or, well, swords, were a set of weapons with their own set bonus and a simple objective of just having them drop. No quests, no long process, just get lucky and hope they drop. And with a drop rate of 5% each, they were not that uncommon, to be fair. Although many disappointed players would see the Wargraves drop only to realize it was the same one they already had. As you did not need two, you needed the main hand and the offhand specifically. And the last legendary for the Burning Crusade was also another one you just simply had to hope for it to drop, Thoradel, who dropped from Kil'jaeden in Sunwell Plateau. This legendary's only real effect, other than being a really strong weapon, was that it generated its own arrows, meaning hunters no longer need to waste money and backspace on carrying arrows around, even commonly used in Wrath of the Lich King when farming weaker content to simply save the hunter some cash. Funny enough though, the arrows it generated did not give a DPS boost like normal ammo would. So, there's been some call for the Burning Crusade to allow hunters to use normal ammo with the legendary bow, or have its magical ammo deal an equal amount of damage equal to the best ammo. The bow did do a ton more base damage than the other epic bows in the same raid tier to compensate, making it a big DPS boost for Hunter's steady shot rotation, which didn't use ammo as part of its damage anyway. So it was still a big DPS boost, however. Speaking of Wrath of the Lich King, we move to the frozen norths of Northrend with the second raid tier of the expansion Ulduar. We raid a Titan city, and in it we get a Titan artifact, first found as 30 fragments which drop from bosses. You would then combine them together and chuck the weapon into the mouth of Yogg-Saron himself, and upon killing him you would then obtain the legendary healer mace of Valenar. Then in the raid on Icecrown Citadel itself we have the sister weapon of the Frostmourne named the Shadowmourne. This two-handed axe was attained by doing a long quest line, requiring you to gather Arthas's hammer left where he found Frostmourne, gather a ton of primordial serenite, collect blood from the abominations of the Plague Quarter, to then craft Shadow's Edge, an epic axe. Not done yet, you then need to go to the final boss of each wing and perform a special infusion. Only then can you begin collecting Shadowfrost shards, requiring you to gather 50 Shadowfrost shards, which had a chance to drop from ICC 25-man bosses, with a higher chance on heroic, meaning you need to kill at least 50 bosses. And once you've collected all these shards, the weapon could finally be completed. Although you weren't done yet, the only legendary to do so, you could then use the axe to slay the Lich King, and if you did, you would gather many items Arthas kept from his past life, and return them to their original owners, and in exchange get a variety of items you could keep from yourself, or sell on the auction house, making this legendary still worth obtaining even today, as selling these items turns a pretty profit. With the Broken World of the Cataclysm, we are granted another 2 legendaries. First, the Dragonwrath's Tergros' Rest. This staff was obtained through a long questline within Firelands to kill many bosses and perform special encounters against new enemies within the Firelands, growing it from a simple branch of Nordisol into the Rune Staff, and then the legendary Dragonwrath. Although the players who wanted the staff would be set back about 9,000 gold because of the gold requirements for it as well. But the staff had some unique things about it. First, it had an on-use effect that transformed the player into a dragon flying mount, the only weapon ever to do so. although a shame it was never added to the mount journal, as in order to use it, you still need to equip the staff from your bags, and then put your staff back every time you want to mount up. But also, by having a member of the guild obtain the staff, a small pet version of Terragosa would be added to your guild shop, allowing all guild members to buy the little pet. And then next, we have the Fangs of the Father. These daggers were the first class-specific legendary, or at least the first legendary specific to one class, that being the Rogue. These legendary daggers had their own set bonus, and also an on-use slow fall effect, giving the Rogue a pair of dragon wings. To obtain these daggers, you first need to pickpocket the boss from Hagar within Dragon Soul, then wait 12 real-life hours, then complete many rogue-based quests where the player need to sneak around enemies and infiltrate places, like Ravenhold to slay Rathion's sibling Black Dragons. Then getting a pair of epic daggers that would be upgraded to even more powerful epic daggers after killing Dragon Soul bosses, to then again be upgraded into legendary daggers after killing even more bosses from the Dragon Soul raid. After so many legendaries of simply killing tons of raid bosses to get the materials to make them, legendaries in Mists of Pandaria decided to shake it up a bit. Mists of Pandaria started with the special legendary stat gems. These could be placed into unique Shaw Touch weapons from the current raid tier, then becoming only more powerful when they added the Eye of the Black Prince to add another socket to the Shaw Touch weapons. Players could then earn legendary meta gems that would fit into their helmets, only then beat out by epic capes they could obtain that then in the final patch of the expansion could be upgraded to legendary quality. One for each of the Celestials, physical DPS, spellcaster DPS, healers, and tanks. The quest lines were long but unique in that they offered so many little items along the way, and gave every single player access to a legendary, especially since the items you needed from raids to get were player specific. No more fighting on who gets the first Shadowmourne, and instead of that, every player could focus on getting their legendary at the same time. And this is something most of the player base and Blizzard really liked, and so they kept it in. Before we move on to the next expansion, fun fact, originally there was data mined itemed Breath of the Black Prince, which points to an early concept that the Shaw-touched weapons we were empowering were to continue to be empowered by cleansing them of their Shaw corruption and creating a legendary weapon for every class. But sadly, it was seemingly scrapped later on in development in favor of the legendary capes. Then in Warlords of Draenor, we kept up with this unique legendary situation. We got 5 legendary rings: Agility DPS, Strength DPS, Intellect DPS, Healers, and Tanks. We started the quest line with a simple clearing of dungeons to receive epic rings. These rings would then be upgraded time and time again by doing dungeons to get different cores, and of course, Apexis crystals alongside Khadgar. You then need to clear High Maul for special materials to upgrade your ring again, only then to do it again in Blackrock Foundry. After this, you would then get a legendary follower, Garona Half-Orcan. Hellfire Citadel and the Garrison Shipyard, both things added in 6.2, these things you needed in order to finally upgrade the ring to its legendary status. Also with this patch, they made it so you could buy the materials needed from the last raid for lots of Apexis crystals. The rings were quite unique. First off, they could have their item level upgraded by 3 every week, to a maximum of 795. These upgrades came from killing Archimonde every week after getting the legendary, or buying the upgrades using Valor points. But these rings had a very special effect. When used, it activated all other rings of the same type, also sharing their cooldowns, doing things like increased damage and then causing the player who used it to explode for a percentage of the damage that all the players dealt. While cool, the players hated this thing, simply because one player could press it and mess up the entire fight, as giving every member of your raid a raid-wide DPS cooldown is not really a great idea. Not everyone has as good restraints as the people who are normally supposed to pop Bloodlust. Over the past 2 expansions, with everyone has a legendary, meaning they're no longer special, was a common complaint about the new system, although Legion was about to bring that to a full stop. Legion came up with a new system, which was usually referred to as the Legendaries. These Legendaries range from generic ones used by any class or healer, to specific classes and specific specs. And there were tons of these, and they dropped randomly from doing world bosses, killing bosses, and more. Keyword, randomly. This was a massive complaint to the player base, as having to go through so many legendaries for someone to get their BIS legendary first, while you get yours last, was a real problem, and a very frustrating one too. This was not fixed until the very end of the expansion, with the vendor added that allowed you to farm and then buy legendaries, specific ones for yourself, or tokens that could then be sent to alts to allow them to get some legendaries. You could originally only wear one of these, but by doing your class hall campaign and researching, you could eventually wear 2 at once. Before we move on, there are 2 more things to talk about. First, there are the crafted legendaries. These legendaries were made by leatherworkers, tailors, and blacksmiths. These items were mostly focused around leveling or just doing content quickly, good for alts or farming old content, and with effects that focused on movement speed or getting buffs from kills. Lastly, there are the Titanic trinkets from the Raid and Taurus. These trinkets were mostly epic and quite easy to get, and could even be upgraded by killing Argus each week. Just like the rings from Warlords of Draenor. However, there was one trinket, Amonthul's Vision. This trinket was legendary and very powerful, and even though it was a legendary, it did not fill the 2 legendary cap that the others did, although its drop rate was abysmal. Doing the boss every week on multiple difficulties till the expansion ended, it was common to only see 1 or 2 of these drop ever. In the next expansion, Battle for Azeroth, Blizzard listened and got rid of the massive amount of legendaries, instead waiting until the final major patch of the expansion to give us Astra Comus. This legendary was obtained and then upgraded entirely through doing the 8.3 feature Horrific Visions, giving you increased stats, buffing future Horrific Vision runs, and giving you corruption resistance, allowing you to wear more corrupted gear, a type of gear specific to the final patch of BFA, which gave you increased effects at the debuff of gaining corruption, which gave ill effects if you wore too much of it. Unlike past upgraded legendaries, this one was legendary from the start. However, as you upgraded it, its visual appearance and the special effects it got changed as you leveled it up. Although once fully leveled up, the cape could then be again increased in power by doing a few things, like the weekly Horrific Visions or N'Zoth kills. And that's it for Battle for Azeroth, very simple. So now let's go over to the Shadowlands. With the Shadowlands expansion, they added a new legendary system. First, you would need to do a varying content, rep grinding, PvP, Torghast, raids, dungeons, and by doing these, you would get legendary memories. You would learn them, adding them to a list that then would be brought to a being known as the Rune Crafter, going to him with these memories and scrolls of stats, as well as specific armor pieces crafted specifically for legendaries. They could be combined with Soul Ash obtained from Torghast to create a custom legendary. You chose the power, you chose which slot it goes in, you chose the stats, and you choose the item level. Of course, higher item levels need more Soul Ash and stronger armor pieces. Theoretically, that makes Shadowlands having the most legendaries of any expansion ever. Although if you only count the memories and not the crafted specific amounts of items you could make, I think Legion still has it beat. So, as you can see, legendaries have had many versions over the years. Vanilla with more of a focus on having to obtain rare drops, the Burning Crusade with the legendary itself being a rare drop, Wrath of the Lich King, Cataclysm, and Vanilla's Atiesh, needing you to kill tons of bosses to get the materials, with breakups like Little Events Quest, and then Mist of Pandaria, Warlords of Draenor, and BFA, following the same idea, but with each player working on their own legendary instead of needing to compete. Then Legion with just legendaries all over the place, very similar to Diablo 3, and Shadowlands with crafted legendaries, basically taking the Legion version and more streamlining it. There are a lot of different versions of the legendaries throughout the course of the game, and each of them had their own pros and cons. In this video, we're looking at the changes made to mount equipment throughout the history of World of Warcraft. We'll start off in Vanilla and Classic WoW, with a trinket named Carrot on a Stick. When worn, this trinket increases the mount speed of a player by 3%. To obtain the item, you need to pick up the quest from Whizzle Brass Bolts located in the Zone of Thousand Needles. The name of this quest is called Gazrilla, and to complete it, it requires a player to go to the Dungeon of Zul'Farrak and kill the Hydra Demigod boss. This was a level 50 quest, and unfortunately not as simple as it sounds. To summon Gazrilla, players need to bang on a gong with the Mallet of Zul'Farrak. To create the mallet, it required doing several steps in the hinterlands before the player could finally enter the dungeon and bang the gong. First, players must kill Kiong the Keeper and Mortigia the Keeper at the Altar of Zol in Hinterlands, which drops a sacred mallet. Next, players must go to Chintha Alor and head to the top of the city past many mobs before clicking on the altar to transform the sacred mallet into the Mallet of Zul'Farrak. Then, players have to head across the world, enter Zul'Farrak, kill Gazrilla, and loot Gazrilla's electrified scale. After completing this dungeon quest and returning to Whizzle Brass Bolts with proof of the monster's demise, players could at last turn in the quest to obtain the Carrot on a Stick's trinket. This quest was later changed in Wrath and Cataclysm. The requirement of having to have the mallet to ring the gong was removed in Wrath. The quest itself was also completely removed from the game in Cata when the Zone of Thousand Needles was tsunami flooded by a certain angry, edgy black dragon. The next item to benefit mounts in Classic WoW comes from the enchanting profession. This enchant, simply named Riding Skill, can only be applied to armor items in the hand slot. When applied and worn, this permanent enchant increases mount speed by 2%. However, the formula to learn this enchant is a very rare world drop. It also has about a 1% drop rate from Nefarian as well. To craft the enchant, it requires an enchanting skill of 250, and its ingredients are 2 large brilliant shards and 3 rich illusion dust. The final item from Classic that increases mounted speed came from another profession item, this time blacksmithing. Mithril spurs were a blacksmithing only augment in Classic and could be applied to the feet armor slot to increase mounted movement speed by 4%. The plans for Mithril spurs are a very low world drop chance and can be looted from Magister Calandris in the Diremol dungeon. To craft Mithril spurs, it requires a blacksmithing skill of 235 and requires 4 Mithril bars and 3 solid grinding stones. The Mithril spurs themselves were not soulbound, so they could be traded or sold, but they still required a blacksmith to add them to the foot armor slot all the way until the end of the Burning Crusade. The cool thing about all these mount improvement items in Classic was that their effects could be stacked. So as long as the player was a blacksmith in Classic, they could have a plus 9% movement speed increase to their mounts. That's 3% from the carrot on a stick, 2% from the glove enchant, and 4% from the boot augment, for a total of a 9% upgrade. Now we move on to WoW's first expansion, the Burning Crusade. TBC saw 2 trinkets that added a mount speed of 10%. Unfortunately, none of these trinkets stacked with any of the items from Classic, which also increased mount movement speed. The first trinket is called the Riding Crop. This trinket was crafted with a leatherworking, which required a skill of 350. The pattern for the Riding Crop is sold by Thomas Yance in the Old Hillsbrad Foothills in the Escape from Durnhold dungeon, which is accessible by the Caverns of Time. As an interesting side note, during the TBC beta, this trinket actually increased mount speed by 25%. But Blizzard probably thought that was too OP and reduced it. The second trinket, called the Skybreaker Whip, can be obtained from the Netherwing Orcs off the south of Shadowmoon Valley. To get this trinket, players have to complete a series of daily quests until they're honored with a Netherwing. Then the player has to complete the Dragonmaw race, Captain Skyshatter. The Skybreaker Whip's flavor text reads, "Property of the Top Orc," a reference to the movie Top Gun. And of course, because Blizzard hates fun like this, these 2 trinkets do not stack with each other, or spells like the Paladin's Crusader aura. Both of these trinkets, when equipped, are just barely above the speed increase from all the mount improvement items in vanilla. When combined, all the items from Classic give a 9% increased speed, and one of these trinkets gives a 10% increased speed. So these trinkets are better, but only 1% better than their Classic mount improvement counterparts. Now we move on to the Wrath of the Lich King. While there were no mount improvement items added in the expansion, there are 2 things of note. First, at the very beginning of Wrath, Blizzard nerfed the trinkets from TBC so they no longer worked up players above level 70. The other interesting fact is that in the Wrath beta, there actually was another Riding Crop that could be crafted. However, this Riding Crop was more like an enchant or an augment because it applied a 10% mount speed buff to a mount when it was in the player's inventory. However, it was also consumed in the process. With mount collecting becoming increasingly popular, Blizzard might have decided to just abandon the idea, because it would be so expensive and time consuming to have to enchant every single mount a player wanted to use. The next mount improvement item comes from the Warlords of Draenor expansion. The Swift Riding Crop was a consumable item that granted the player the ability to instantly mount an Ashran for 1 hour. To buy this item, Alliance players need to be honored with the Worm's Vanguard, and Horde players need to be honored with Vol'jin's Spear. The item costs 5 gold and can be bought from Thomas Ryogen, the Stormship Quartermaster, and for Horde players, Dazarian, the Warspear Quartermaster. These items are in the epic BG version of Ashran at NBFA, so be sure to buy them if you can before the match starts. Unfortunately, this effect does not persist through death. As a fun side note, whether by accident or not, when WoD first launched, Alliance players had to pay 50 gold for the Swift Riding Crop, while Horde players only had to pay 5 gold. While the price was made equal later, it does make you wonder if this could have been a cheeky reference to the Alliance favoritism meme. Next, we move on to the Legion expansion, which really started adding mount equipment to the game. The first item worth discussing can be found in the Sanctum of the Light, which is the Paladin Order Hall located underneath the Lighthouse Chapel in the Eastern Plaguelands. When Paladins collected this item, it gave them a 10% increased mount speed on the Broken Isles. The next 4 mount equipment items all come from various professions from the Legion expansion. Each of these items provides a fun and unique effect to a player's mount. The items are luckily not soulbound, so they can be sold and traded to other players. The first of these 2 items comes from blacksmithing. After completing a short quest, blacksmiths learn how to craft laystone hoofplates with 25 laystone ore. When used, they increase the player's mount speed on the Broken Isles by 20% for 2 hours. However, they are an extra great for blacksmiths because the duration of the buff is quadrupled to an 8-hour-long buff. The second item blacksmith can craft is called the Demon Steel Stirrups, presumably a reference to the mithril spurs of vanilla. These stirrups don't increase movement speed, but instead allow the player to interact with objects while mounted. However, they only work in the Broken Isles. Just like the Laystone Hoofplates, Demon Steel Stirrups are learned by blacksmith through a short quest, and their 2-hour buff is extended to 8 hours for blacksmiths. Demon Steel Stirrups are particularly useful for gathering crafted reagents such as ores and herbs in the Broken Isles, since the player no longer has to dismount to interact with those objects. Of course, there are several limitations to these fun mount equipment items. Unfortunately, only one of these mount equipment items can be equipped at a time, and these items only work in the Broken Isles, meaning they do not work on Argus either. The next mount equipment item for Legion comes from the leatherworking profession. The stone-high leather barding prevents players from being dazed while mounted. Like other mount equipment in Legion, these items only last for 2 hours and only work on the Broken Isles. The effect is also extended for 8 hours for players with leatherworking and is learned from a quest. However, the Stonehide leather barding is pretty expensive to craft as they only require 50 Stonehide leather. The last mount equipment item from the Broken Isles is the Blood Totem Saddle Blanket, made from the tailoring profession. What interesting effect might this item have, you're probably wondering? Turns out, not that interesting. This item just lets you keep a rested experience buff no matter where you log off, as long as you're on the mount with the buff. As such, it's pretty much useless at max level. Its use description says, place a saddle blanket on your mount, making your mount much more comfortable for 2 hours. The effect's duration is quadrupled for tailors. Battle for Azeroth saw the second iteration of this mount equipment added in Legion. Essentially, everything was just copied from Legion into BFA professions, with the names and ingredients changing. All the same effects and the professions that made the mount equipment stayed the same, with there being 3 main changes. First, the BFA mount equipment obviously only works in BFA zones. Second, they use BFA mats, and third, they're learned from trainers and not from quests. A note before we move on, Battle for Azeroth is the only expansion where profession names are different for each faction. For Alliance players, BFA professions start with Kul Tiran, and for Horde, they start with Zandalari. Instead of having to say Kul Tiran and Zandalari professions, we're just going to simplify it down to BFA professions. Just like in Legion, there are 2 mount equipment items for blacksmithing. The first one, called Mono-Hardened Hoofplates, is essentially the same thing as the Laystone Hoofplates from Legion. Like their Laystone Hoofplate counterparts from Legion, Mono-Hardened Hoofplates increase the player's mount speed by 20% for 2 hours, or 8 hours if you're a blacksmith. The second item from BFA blacksmithing are the Mono-Hardened Stirrups, which are the BFA versions of the Demon Steel Stirrups from Legion. They provide the same ability to interact with objects while mounted and are only limited to Kul Tiran and Zandalar. In BFA leatherworkers can craft the coarse leather barding. This item is equivalent to the Stonehide leather barding from Legion and prevents the player from being dazed while mounted. And finally, with BFA tailoring, players can make the Sea Breeze Saddle Blanket, which is equivalent to the Blood Totem Saddle Blanket from Legion. Now we come to the biggest change in WoW regarding mount equipment. In patch 8.2, a new mount equipment slot was added to the mount journal. 5 new items are introduced that could be placed in the slot, with 4 of them being similar abilities from both the Legion and BFA profession items. The first craftable, slottable mount equipment item added in 8.2 that we'll discuss is the Comfortable Rider's Barding. This item can be learned from the BFA leatherworking profession trainer. Similar to the first 2 iterations of the Stonehide leather barding in Legion and the coarse leather barding in BFA, the Comfortable Rider's Barding, when equipped, prevents the players from being dazed while mounted. Now, there are 2 interesting things about crafting this item. First, in BFA crafting, it requires both the coarse leather bard from leatherworking and the Saddle Breeze Saddle Blanket from tailoring. Both of these items must then be combined by the leatherworker in order to make the Comfortable Rider's Barding. The other interesting crafting fact is that this recipe also reappears in Shadowlands leatherworking. So far, this is the only piece of mount equipment in the game that can be crafted from 2 different expansion professions. Crafting the Comfortable Rider's Barding is considerably easier with Shadowlands leatherworking, as it only requires 2 callous hides, 5 lightless silk, and 5 penumbra of thread. Perhaps Blizzard thought that having to make the Comfortable Rider's Barding from BFA with 2 different professions and from 2 different mat-intensive items was too expensive or too much work for the average player. The next piece of slottable mount equipment is crafted using BFA enchanting. The Lightsteep Hoofplates have the same function as the Laystone Hoofplates and the Monotone Hoofplates, but instead of being crafted with blacksmithing, they're crafted by enchanting. However, enchanters do still need to get the Monotone Hoofplates to be used as an ingredient in the recipe. To craft the Lightstep Hoofplates, which increase the player's ground mount speed by 20%, an enchanter will need 2 Umbra Shards, 30 Gloom Dust, and 1 Monotone Hoofplate. The next slottable mount equipment item is called the Saddle Chute, and is made with BFA tailoring. The Saddle Chute gives a mount a unique augment that has not been seen before in the game. When equipped and the player is dismounted high in the air, the player will slowly fall down on a parachute, instead of immediately plummeting to their death. The player must be falling for at least 3 seconds before the parachute deploys. However, the item can be buggy and is very expensive to make, costing 10 embroidered deep sea satin, 50 gilded sea weave, 15 dreaded leather, and 20 nylon thread. The Saddle Chute is so far the only new mount equipment effect that is not some iteration of a previously crafted mount buff item. Now we come to the biggest reason why the mount equipment slot was added. Prior to BFA, there were 2 Water Strider mounts added to the game. These mounts were wholly unique because they were the only mounts in the game that allowed the player to walk on water while mounted. The first Water Strider is the Azure Water Strider. It can be purchased from Nat Pago and the Cross-Soaring Vials for 4,000 gold. However, you must be exalted with the anglers to purchase it. The next Water Strider is the Crimson Water Strider. It can be purchased from Nat Pago for 100 Nat's Lucky's coins in the Garrison from the World of Draenor expansion. However, this mount was far more time-consuming and RNG dependent than a simple rep grind, so the Azure Water Strider was much easier to obtain for players. As you can imagine, a mount that can walk on water was very handy, and it became so handy that almost everyone used it all the time. Over time, most people acquired a Water Strider mount, and in some cases it almost became mandatory in dungeons or battlegrounds. Blizzard saw that most of the mounts being summoned were water striders, and this was one of the big reasons they decided to introduce the mount equipment slot. There were not one, but two different mount equipment items that can be equipped that allow the player's mount to walk on water. The first of these is called the Angler's Water Striders. When 8.2 went live, the water walking ability was removed from the water walking mounts, but players who owned a water strider prior to patch 8.2 were mailed an item called Angler's Water Striders on every level 100 plus character by Nat Pagal. The Angler's Water Striders can also be purchased with Nat Pagal for 45 gold, and even better, the item is account wide, so you can send it to alts. The only downside to the Angler's Water Striders is that the water walking ability is cancelled when the player gets in combat, whereas this was not the case with the original Water Strider mounts. If players didn't want to use the Angler's Water Strider for whatever reason, there was also a craftable mount equipment item from BFA Blacksmithing called Inflatable Mount Shoes, which also allowed the player to walk on water. So far, these are the only 5 mount equipment items added to the game that can be slotted into the mount equipment slot. However, since 2 of these items are both water walking, there are really only 4 effects that mount equipment can give when equipped. Aquatic mounts, the Sky Golem, and the Mechanized Lumber Extractor are the only mounts where the mount equipment won't take effect. When used, the player will get a warning saying your active mount does not benefit from mount equipment because it already has an ability. And to wrap up this video, here are some suggestions for Blizzard. First, make the mount equipment slot be able to hold all 4 or 5 mount equipment items, and have the player be able to choose which effect is active at a time. Currently, players have to manually switch them out, and this also takes up valuable bag space. Another suggestion is to simply come up with more fun mount equipment abilities. Perhaps an item that auto-taunts all mobs in a certain radius for the player, for example. There are many traditions in WoW that each expansion must include. A troll instance, a Hemet Denessary quest chain, a dragon boss, and the biggest of all, the poop quest. The poop quest is a series of quests that focus on poop and poop alone, and every expansion must have at least one. And today, we're going to be going over all of the poop quests. Vanilla WoW started off with 2 quests. Azharite, given by Lormorus Thalapides, the demon hunter in Azhara, who sends you out to find Azharite, which he later explains to you is the poop of the mountain giants. And Kot, given to the player by a dwarf locked inside an outhouse within the Searing Gorge. He begs the player to bring him some silk cloth so that he can wipe his bum with rather expensive fabric, also asking you to kill some Dark Iron geologists in order to buy him time so he can finish up in the outhouse. Then with the Burning Crusade, we got 2 more. First is Shiz's work in the Hellfire Peninsula. Foreman Razoclass suspects that his shredded keys were eaten by one of the Fellhounds, and so he sends you off to kill some Fellboards and then feed them to his Fellhounds, so that you can then, of course, search through their poop for his keys. And lastly, a rare bean. Elementalist Lope in Nagrand has you go around finding piles of animal dung, and find the undigested berries within the dung. Then, he would convert these poopy berries into tablets, and then the player could dissolve those under their tongue in order to breathe underwater for a while. Needless to say, getting something that was in poop, then putting it in your mouth, even if it was cleaned, is peak comedy by Blizzard. Well done. Then with Wrath of the Lich King, we double the amount per expansion, this time with 4 separate poop quests. First, the Funky Fungi within the Ankh-Kahent the Old Kingdom. The player would need to find several revolting mushrooms, then bring them to Killix the Unraveler, a Nerubian who you know would know about these mushrooms, and who would inform you that these were not mushrooms, they were in fact poop, and maybe the player should wash their hands, and in the future to keep any fungus that they might find inside the caves. Next is Lupus Pupus in the Boran Tundra. Iggy Tailspin Cogtoggle thinks that the wolves in the area might have eaten his microfilm, and so you need to place piles of spices on the ground to attract and extract the poop from the wolves to search for the film. To rub it in the player's face, he even mentions a machine that could help him with the dirty work, but he left it back on his airstrip, and heaven forbid he walk back to get it. Next, we have amber seeds in the Grizzly Hills at the Amberside Lodge. Alliance players would find a bucket of amber seeds and then eat them. Master Woodsman Anderhall would then inform you that you have eaten an entire harvest of magical seeds, and you need to do the right thing and, well, poop them out before they're fully digested. And in order to do that, you need to make a laxative. Then you go over to a local outhouse and watch your character do the deed for around 20 seconds before returning the seeds back to him. Afterwards, there's a little bit of dialogue with the questing NPC and the general goods vendor that implies this is not the first time they've had to do this. Lastly, for Wrath of the Lich King, we have Square the Guano out of them in the Howling Fjord. In Rivenwood, you are tasked with gathering bat guano used to make cluster bombs by engineer Fecknut, who is too scared of the bats to gather them himself. So you go and use firecrackers to scare the guano out of the bats. and then even use the guano cluster bombs later on in the daily to break some pirate blockades. Then in Cataclysm, with the total revamp of the old world, they decided to fill it with poop quests. This time a whopping 9 quests, so we need to speed this up a little bit. First is a delivery for Throgazog in the Burning Steppes, where they disguise the player to deliver spiked warg meat to the General Throgazog and his ogre army. Later, you'll find the ogre running away with his hands on his butt, so whatever you did to him seemed to have worked. Bravo Company Field Kit Camouflage in the Red Ridge Mountains has the player create camouflage for the Bravo Company, and so you gather leaves and fox poop, allowing you to stealth for the next 2 following quests by rubbing poopy leaves all over your body. Going Guano in Razorfen Crawl, the guano from the local bats is sending the Quillboar into a frenzy, so Ald Stonespire asks you to gather some so that he can make a possible antidote. Illegible orc letter in the Stone Talon Mountains appears when you find the letter. The letter smells horrid, and so you take it to Minx, who finds out the letter is written in Kodo poop and blood, although a letter from Horde High Command. In the outhouse in the Thousand Needles, after flooding of the Cataclysm, a man has found himself trapped inside of an outhouse, and so you need to grab a crowbar from some nearby pirates to break him free. Riding on in Durotar is rather tame, a simple travel quest. Partway, the wolves would stop for a few moments on the side of the road, before your ally, Raider Kerr, would comment, "What's that smell?" "Oh, bad dog." Stormpike Rendezvous in the Hillsbrad Foothills would send the player to learn about the Stormpike Rendezvous from Orcus. And Orcus informs you that he ate some Durgan's Kickin' Chimera chops and had some stomach issues that caused some loud issues and alerting the enemy to his location. And to save you on some of the details, things just did not turn out well for him. The Turd Problem in Stone Talon Mountains has Ghibli rackets and players to kill local wyverns as they've been leaving large turds all over the place, and he'd rather not be pooped on. The nearby enforcers even complain about it constantly. And lastly, the mysterious Azurite. As mentioned before, we were sent out to find mountain giants, who inform us that every 15 to 25 years they drop their waste, which mortals call Azurite. We are then asked to try and find methods to speed up the production of Azurite, but nothing works. Now onto Mista Pandaria, we drop down to only 5 poop quests, with the first being Greenish Energy in the Jade Forest. Rivet Clutchpop asks the players to make methane grenades, which means going to Hosen outhouses and collecting deposits, then getting on a scat shooting vehicle to repel invading Jinyu forces. Materia Medica in the Krasarang Wilds. The guards at Zoo's Watch have a bad case of spooky dukes, and so Ken sends the players to get ingredients for an old Hosen remedy. Then giving it to a guard causes them to have a few issues, leading them to run to a nearby bush. The guard then commenting, "Ugh, what was that stuff? It went through me like bad tea." The next quest, a daily simply called Pooped, in the Jade Forest, has your serpent to hatchling leaving an accident all over the place, and well, you need to clean it up before the serpent masters find out. And lastly, Gourmet Kaffa in the Kunlun Summits. Gootfur comes up with a Gourmet Kaffa Goot, passing through goats first. However, the Kaffa is far too potent, resulting in a horrid mess on the mountainside. You are then tasked with marking the piles with flags, so he can clean them up later. Although this is the first NPC so far in the history of Poop Quest to thankfully deal with the gross work themselves. Even saying, kind of messy task, not fit for a hero. Now onto Warlords of Draenor with only 3, one of them being one of the very first quests in the next expansion. Gunnar of the Frostwolves during the Assault in the Dark Portal scenario. You were sent to rescue Gunnar and find him being forced to shovel excrement from the outpost into a pool. Fruitful Ventures in Nagrand has a diagram ore bar asking the player to gather cherries to feed his Elec. While the quest itself does not include poop, it does make a reference to the A Rare Bean mentioned earlier on this list. Heard the worst rumor about how you had to obtain these things. Something about Talbuk first eating them and then processing them and then, well, I don't want to talk about it. Which is a nice little callback to the poop quest from Nagrand in the Burning Crusade. And lastly, Ruby's Rue. While not a quest, it was a treasure that included such. While searching Admiral Taylor's garrison, the player could find a ghostly perky pug named Ruby Rue. Giving him some ruby reets, he would go outside and deposit a pile of ruby rues, which had his collar and some garrison resources in it. Now onto Legion, all the way down to only 2 quests. A key is around here somewhere. A quest in Siramar given by Angus Stormbrew. Caught by the Legion, he had a key to break himself out, but a Fellhound ate it. So he then asked you to search through the piles of demonic waste nearby in order to find his key. A wee bit of cloth in Silithus, introduced of course after the stabbing of Silithus. You approach the outhouse in the Twilight Hammer camp to find Angus Stormbrew again. who is stuck in there having gone in for a wee drop-off, but there's no cloth to, so he sends you to find some Twilight Silk for him. And once he does finish up, he lights a match to deal with the fumes, and in the process blows up the outhouse, running out unhurt but pantless. Now we move on to Battle for Azeroth, with 4 quests. Foul Harvest in Vol'dun, an herbalist-only quest given by Patu, asking you to collect Akunda's bite seeds from the sun-baked dung piles, saying that only the seeds that have survived being eaten, digested, and pooped out will be able to survive Vol'dun's heat. Rodrigo's Revenge in the Tierguard Sound has players get on Rodrigo's giant parrot and bombard the nearby Irontide raiders with poop to deter them from future threats against him. Swab This, a world quest in the Tierguard Sound, you mount up on a massive parrot and bombard them with bird poop. This is the same as Rodrigo's Revenge, but was just a world quest version available to both factions, because the other one was alliance only. Lastly, the quest Fertilizer Duty in Vol'dun. The player is sent to gather meat and then offer them to hyenas and then wait for them to leave drop-ins, to then pick them up and bring it back. This is also available as a world quest afterwards. And lastly, for Shadowlands. Now, how could there possibly be poop in the afterlife? Well, nature finds a way. There only being 1 poop quest, but to be fair, we still have more Shadowlands to come. Nothing goes to waste in Ardenwald. The Gormlings are industrious creatures. They love to eat everything and are, well, a great source of Gorm Grist, which they expel when they finish eating lots of stuff. And so a few have been growing Gorms like cattle and collecting their Gorm Grist. And so Master Shalar has you draw some baby Gormlings from their pens to eat some wild seeds to grow, and well, produce more Gorm Grist. The next quest, Collecting Day, having you actually collect the Gorm Grist by encouraging them with a branch. If you started playing after Mist of Pandaria, you might be more accustomed to the talent rows we have today, and not very much the talent trees of old. This video will go over the general changes to talent trees as a whole, and not really the specifics of the talents themselves. The very first talent trees in WoW's alpha was way different than anything we got in-game. It was basically this weird interface window similar to the class trainer table, which allowed you to spend talent points to get various different skills and passives that allowed you to hyper-specialize your class. You got about 10 talent points a level, and each skill cost about 10 talent points to learn. So if you wanted to be really good with an axe, for example, you could spend talent points into increasing its damage, hit chance, crit, and chance to parry with it. Or give yourself some extra damage to only beast types, increase your base stats, magical power, resistances to specific types of magic. It was surprisingly robust. Although it might have been too hyper-focused, as it was eventually dropped and replaced with the more traditional talent tree we're all familiar with. With Vanilla WoW, we got the 31-point talent trees. You got 1 new point for each new level starting at level 10. So, once you hit level 60, you had 51 talent points to spend. You could spend the talent points however you wanted across the 3 trees, but usually the better abilities were buried deep in the tree, so you'd be incentivized to spend points in one tree to get all the way down to the last talent. Although, being Vanilla WoW and the worst balance the game has ever been, a lot of the 31st talent points were bad, or not worth grabbing. Feral Druid's last talent just reduced the mana cost of shapeshifting by about 25 or 30%. The Survival Hunter tree's last talent was for Lacerate, one of the worst talents in the game's history, as it did terrible damage and scaled poorly. So, in order to fix some of these problems, Blizzard decided to do class overhauls halfway through vanilla, starting with Hunters, because for some reason, Blizzard decided it would be a good idea to only focus on one class at a time each patch. Not that they couldn't adjust all specs with each patch, they made a very purposeful decision to only do one at a time. And because of this, people would go crazy on the forums and say their class needed to be fixed next, which led to the infamous bus shock incident. In order to prep for class overhauls, Blizzard asked the forums for feedback on certain classes at certain times. When it was the Shaman's turn to have its discussion, the community manager in charge of the Shamans got sick that week and missed it, so they had another CM replace him. Then, when the next patch came out, they did Shamans and Mages at the same time. Mages got a whole bunch of good and much needed changes to their class, and Shamans got one buff and a ton of nerfs. So, like what happens today, the Shaman forums went nuts and blamed the CM for the nerfs and pinned it on the week he got sick. But he didn't respond to any of the criticism, except for one thread that said he should get hit by a bus. And thus, the bus shock incident, because shamans use shocks, of course. In the Burning Crusade, classes got 2 new rows of talents for 41-point talent trees. Just like in vanilla, you got 1 talent every new level until level 70. The Burning Crusade was the golden age of hybrid builds. Many classes had really good abilities that combined well with abilities in other talent trees in the earlier tiers, like Warlocks and their infamous SLSL build, where they went halfway down in 2 trees to pick up Soul Link and Siphon Life to be nearly unkillable in PvP while dishing out a ton of dot damage. Now, since this video is about the history of the trees and not the history of hybrid specs, which could be a whole video on its own, I'll leave it at there and move on to Wrath talents. With Wrath of the Lich King, players got 2 new rows of talents again, for a 51-point talent tree. With this huge tree, Wrath of the Lich King had the biggest talent tree in the game's history. And with these new bigger trees, it was a little harder to hybrid, as Blizzard moved potentially really good combo abilities higher on the list, so they couldn't be comboed. Or just straight up put exceptions in their abilities, like with Readiness and Bestial Wrath. Readiness was a hunter talent that reset the cooldown of all of your other abilities, and Bestial Wrath was an insanely good BM Hunter cooldown that made you immune to CC for 18 seconds as well. So in order to stop hunters from taking both abilities to have nearly 40 seconds of CC immunity, they just added an exclusion of resets the cooldowns of all of your hunter abilities except Bestial Wrath. And to even further force people to play pure builds, they put some of the best abilities the class could get at the 51st spot. To use hunters as an example again, survival hunters got explosive shot as the last talent, and that one ability accounted for half of a survival hunter's ray damage, making it absolutely necessary to take. This was also the expansion that introduced dual talent specialization. What this meant was you could have 2 sets of talents saved at a time, and then swap between them whenever you wanted, at the cost of a long cast time, needing to be out of combat, and losing all of your mana. But it also swapped over your bars like swapping specs today does. This was a much welcome change to talent specs, as now healers and tanks didn't have to go back to town to respec if they were needed to DPS, and vice versa. Hunters had many talent trees for their pets added this expansion, which stayed in the game until Miss. Hunter pets got 3 different talent trees depending on which kind of pet they were, started earning talent points at level 20, and gained a new one every 4 levels, for a total of 16 points at max level. Plus, BM Hunter's final talent gave them about 5 more talent points to spend, which was a nice little bonus to pet damage. Wrath is also the expansion that introduced glyphs to modify your abilities and classes even further, because this was when glyphs could still give DPS upgrades and not just cosmetic changes, making Wrath one of the most customizable expansions for your character, based on just the pure amount of it. Then in Cataclysm, they wanted to fix the mass amount of talents, and cut them in half. Now you would only get a new talent every 2 levels, and you couldn't pick talents in other trees until you had spent enough talents in the tree you'd pick first. But in exchange for being forced to a spec, you got special abilities right off the bat when you picked a talent tree, plus major passive buffs. With Cataclysm, Blizzard was finally able to kill the hybrid specs once and for all by not allowing you to progress far enough in another tree to even attempt it. People had mixed opinions on these new trees, but since most players just net deck talent tree choices anyway, it's not like having fewer of them really made a difference at max level. Plus, with a smaller tree, the talent points gave better bonuses with every 2 levels than the old ones did when the trees were huge and all of the increases were minor. But then come Mists of Pandaria, and the end of the talent trees as we know it. Mists of Pandaria decided to just remove talent trees altogether, and instead give players a new talent row choice system, where every 15 levels or so, you get to pick 1 of 3 talents. Each one was supposed to be either a powerful passive or a new ability altogether, with some rows sharing themes, like one row being nothing but movement abilities and stuff. And the talents were shared across all 3 specs. You just chose a spec, and then the talents would sometimes have multiple effects to account for different specs. Also, instead of having to go to your trainer to reset your talents, you could use an item to change 1 talent row at a time, per charge of said item, or go to a trainer to reset all rows at once. In Warlords of Draenor, they also added one more row to the talents, giving classes 7 rows of talents and just adding an extra row at level 100. So you still got a new talent every 15 levels until level 90 when you got your next row in 10 levels at level 100. They also modified glyphs to no longer give major DPS boosts, and be almost purely situational improvements, give self-heals, and change the functionality of abilities, which sometimes did increase their damage slightly anyway. Then in Legion, they modified talent rows a little further by making them spec-specific, and doing away with multi-spec. Now, all of your specs just had their own bars and talent points, just like swapping talents with the old dual talent specialization. In order to change out talents, you had to use an item that would allow you to change all of your talents within a 1-minute window, or go back to a rested area to freely change them, which means you no longer had a reason to ever go back to your class trainer. Legion also introduced the PvP talents. Only available at max level, you could unlock talents by grinding out honor, and the talents only became active in PvP scenarios. This talent tree also worked on the pick one of 3 abilities principle that the regular talent tree operates on. Glyphs that improve or alter your class's abilities were completely removed in Legion, and glyphs are now almost purely cosmetic. Now, as a little side note, with the introduction of Demon Hunters and them starting off at level 98, they get a new talent every 2 levels until level 110, being the only class that doesn't have all of its talents at level 100, and also being one of the most fun classes to level, since you get a new ability every 2 levels. And now, onto the newest expansion, Battle for Azeroth. With BFA, Blizzard made absolutely no changes to the talent tree, again, for the 2nd expansion in a row. This is the longest we've gone without getting a new row of talents or talent changes, with Legion and now BFA. But instead, they revamped the PvP talents to be an option where you can choose any combination of 3, plus a CC break talent, for a potential of 4 extra talents if you choose to use War Mode. But these talents are only active in the open world with War Mode on, and of course in PvP scenarios, so they make no difference in raid or dungeon settings. And that's the history of talent trees for as far as we know it. There were also a lot of changes to glyphs, but I'm going to cover those in a different video, so I only briefly mentioned them in this one. I personally vastly preferred the talent tree style of old, as it made leveling more fun, getting a small little boost of power each level. But at max level, the talent system we have now is better to work with, I hate to admit. When it comes to pet battles, Blizzard only ever balances them once an expansion. So, at the end of each expansion, they go through a whole bunch of balance changes to fix some of the more overpowered pets. And occasionally, they do fix the mid-expansion, but in the case of Legionnaire Murky, and the Blood Boil pet to an extent, these pets had one ability that was so overpowered, they just straight up removed it from the game, rather than try to balance it. Which is the first and only time since that they've done this in pet battles. Legionnaire Murky was the Horde version of the 2016 BlizzCon pet. They had one for both faction, and each was sufficiently overpowered as they had basically the same abilities with a few differences. But one ability they had in common was called Murgle Murgle, which had the effect to sacrifice half of your health in order to summon a clone to help you for 5 rounds. Now, this ability is similar to the substitute move that's used in Pokemon, where a Pokemon would sacrifice 25% of their health in order to summon a scapegoat, who would basically be destroyed after taking 1 attack. And the main purpose of this thing was for it to take status effects or to absorb a really big move by your opponent. But the clone created with the pet battle ability worked nothing like this, and what it did was basically summon an identical clone of your pet, who couldn't be attacked and could attack at the end of every round with one of your pet's other 2 abilities at random, with no cooldown and at full power. So it was basically like summoning an additional pet to fight for you, which was actually better, since it could use cooldown based abilities without those cooldowns. And Legionnaire Murky had 2 cooldown based abilities that it could pick in its other 2 slots for the clone to use. One of them was a 1 round ability cooldown that just hits as hard as a normal attack, and also increases the damage of your current pet by 25% for 3 rounds. And this ability was supposed to be balanced around the fact that it has a 1-turn cooldown, so it can't use it every turn, and it takes the place of your basic attack, so there's a good chance you'll have a turn in which you have no usable abilities. Although the clone could just use this as many times as it wanted at full power with the full effect buffing your frontline pet. The clone also had the Whirlwind ability, which is an AoE split damage ability that hits for 150% the damage of a regular basic attack and splits the damage with all of your opponent's active pets. And this ability is really good and is balanced around having a 3-round cooldown. But just like with the other ability, the clone could spam this one every turn if they wanted to. And if it did spam this ability for all 5 rounds, that makes it one of the best pets in the game in just terms of pure DPS. Although it would swap between the two abilities, but basically this clone could do more damage than any normal pet possibly could. And you could also still just use your other pets like normal. The clone ability was essentially like having a 4th pet whenever you used it, who attacked alongside your active pet, and the only way to counter it was to have a move that could just destroy objects on the battlefield. Which there are some pets that can do that, but you'd have to have one of those pets on your team before the battle started to stand a chance. So if you didn't have a way to destroy objects, there was basically nothing you could do. Although Legionnaire Murky wasn't the only pet with a clone ability, there was also another pet called the Blood Boil, which was added to the game like a month or 2 before Legionnaire Murky came out, and it had an ability called Split, which was exactly the same as the Murgle Murgle ability that Murky had, where you sacrifice half your HP to summon a clone for 5 turns. And the Blood Boil did have a cooldown based ability to use with the clone as well, called Drain Blood, which drains 10% of your opponent's maximum HP in order to heal you for 300% of the health absorbed. And whenever the clone used this ability, it would heal the original Blood Boil pet, and since the heal is incredibly good, and balanced around the fact that it has a 3-round cooldown, the Blood Boil was almost unkillable while the clone was out. Although the Blood Boil's clones did not do as much damage as the Murkies, as Drain Blood doesn't hit very hard, and it only had a normal basic attack as its other ability. So it's really the Murkies who were the most broken pets in the game, and Blood Boil probably would have taken that spot if the Legionnaire Murkies hadn't come out soon afterwards. And there's also the Alliance version of the pet, Knight Captain Murky, who had a dodge ability as one of its moves, which the clone pet could spam, and would affect your current pet. So if you use the Alliance version of the pet, while the clone was out, you were basically unhittable for 5 turns, which was also incredibly good. And not only was the clone ability super powerful just regularly, it was also bugged, where it would do an extra attack whenever your opponent brought out another pet during a death swap. Because you see, when a pet dies, you get to choose another pet to come in to continue fighting. And for some reason, the clone was programmed to do an attack when your opponent did this death swap, basically giving you an extra attack in between rounds. And since Legionnaire Murky was doing so much damage, and you also just had a normal pet that could attack while the clone was out, you're almost guaranteed to kill one of your opponent's pets, and then get a free attack when they swapped out. So how Blizzard thought to fix this was to just remove the ability from all 3 pets who could use it, and then they just gave them a new ability that pets with their movesets usually would have. The abilities they just gave them were standard abilities that were already in the game, so they're not worth talking about. The important thing is, they tried out a new thing for this ability, and it was so strong and buggy, they thought to just remove it rather than try to fix it. And since then, they have added new abilities to the game, but they have never added anything similar to these clone abilities. And that's it as far as Legionnaire Murky fiasco goes. They introduced a broken, overpowered ability, and then they removed it when they found out it was broken and overpowered. They have had to do emergency fixes like this in the past, but I think they've only ever done it one other time, to be perfectly honest, and that was in the pet battle's early days in Mist of Pandaria. So there's only been 2 emergency fixes to pets over the course of pet battles, unless I'm missing one of them, but this is the only time they just straight up removed an ability rather than trying to nerf it, as they have nerfed other abilities multiple times over the years.